There are 195 recognized countries in the world doing their best to navigate the unforgiving arena of global geopolitics. However, only one country among them has been unrivaled as the world's supreme military power for years, the United States. And that's why it shouldn't be surprising that this military titan might be ranked as the #1 military power once again in 2024. To be fair, quantifying military power is a tricky endeavor, as the numbers don't always tell the whole story. However, the US's dominance extends far beyond mere statistics, encompassing cutting-edge technological innovation, logistical prowess, and unparalleled operational capabilities that cement its status as the world's preeminent military force. So in this video, we will play the numbers game, but we'll also look at what those numbers represent. Regarding the numbers, we'll primarily consult Global Firepower's Military Strength Rankings, an annual report that comprehensively assesses military capabilities worldwide. For 2024, Global Firepower, or GFP for short, evaluated 145 countries across 60 individual factors to determine each nation's military strength. Some of these factors are troop numbers, military equipment, and financial stability. Again, accurately ranking military power involves more than just numbers. For instance, one country might possess a large tank fleet filled with outdated or poorly maintained vehicles, while another may have a smaller fleet, composed of modern, well-maintained tanks equipped with advanced technology. However, while the exact GFP ranking might be off for a few countries, the data is accurate primarily from official sources. So without further ado, let's dive into the state of the US military in 2024 to understand why this country commands the respect and the fear of nations around the globe. First, let's talk about money. After all, no country can maintain military dominance without substantial financial investment. And when it comes to the US's annual defense spending budget, calling it a substantial financial investment might just be the understatement of the century. Why? The defense budget the US Congress approved for 2024 is a staggering $886 billion, roughly 3.3% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Though this number is insanely impressive in and of itself, it becomes mind-blowing when you consider how much other nations are spending on defense. The #2 nation, China, plans to spend $236.1 billion on defenses in 2024, a notable 7.2% leap from the previous year. This increase is even higher with the third-ranked nation, Russia, which intends to spend around $109 billion on national defense, approximately 30% more than in 2023. As monumental as the difference between the US's military budget and the ones from the second and third-ranking countries, it's also important to note that the US probably won't see any significant increases in defense spending anytime soon. You see, the increase in the US military budget was capped at 1% in 2023 thanks to a 2-year budget deal. But even after those 2 years pass, financial experts don't see significant changes in the US's military budget for at least 2 more years. Afterward, the experts estimate that the budget could gradually rise to $922 billion in 2035. But let's go back to the present for now. What is the US spending its military budget on? Though this budget must cover numerous aspects of a standing fighting force, 4 areas might be the most crucial: operation and maintenance, research and development of weapons and equipment, procurement of weapons and systems, and military personnel. Speaking of military personnel, number-wise, how strong is the US military in 2024? Let's start with the total available military manpower. This figure refers to the total number of people a nation could mobilize in the event of a war, be it offensive or defensive in nature. Remember that this number can only be estimated and represents a rough picture of the potential force size, not an exact count. According to GFP estimates, the US could commit almost 150 million people to its war effort, roughly 44% of its total population. Though this figure is undoubtedly impressive, it isn't the highest in the world. Of course, this shouldn't be surprising, as the US isn't the most populous country in the world. That title belongs to India, closely followed by China, with each country having more than 1.4 billion people. With this discrepancy in population in mind, it's perfectly understandable that India and China rank better in terms of total manpower, both being able to commit over 650 million people to their respective war efforts. A similar situation can be seen in the number of people fit for military service. As the name suggests, these are the able-bodied people who could theoretically fight or participate in material production during a long-running war campaign. The US roughly has 124 million troops, while India and China can offer 4 to 5 times more. But let's move away from potential scenarios. How many active duty personnel does the US have in 2024? In other words, how many soldiers are currently engaged in full-time military work and could be ready to fight for the nation at any given moment? The answer is approximately 1.3 million highly trained individuals. Though this figure places the U.S. in the top 3 countries in the world, it's important to note that the number of active duty personnel has been declining for quite some time. That's why the current figures are far from the most recent peak of over 2 million active duty soldiers in 1987. But what about reserve personnel? Unfortunately, this isn't where the U.S. shines in the 2024 military power ranking. But before delving into the details, let's explain the difference between active and reserve duty. Think of it this way. Active duty is a full-time job, while reserve duty can be compared to a part-time job. Reservists are considered an optional military component and are basically on call for service at any given moment. The U.S. has almost 800,000 of these reservists as part of its military force in 2024. The figure is nowhere near Vietnam's 5 million reservists, which occupies the #1 position globally. It's also significantly lower than 3 other nations in the top 5 in the military power ranking of 2024. South Korea, with over 3 million reservists, Russia with approximately 2 million, and India with roughly 1.15 million reserve duty personnel. The only other country in the top 5 with fewer reservists is China, which has 500,000. There are 2 ways to look at this number, one more positive and the other quite the opposite. On one hand, the relatively low number of reservists in the U.S. could be attributed to the country's reliance on a well-established active duty force and sophisticated military technology. On the other hand, the number of U.S. reservists could be related to how overused the military component is. As things currently stand, some reservists are expected to provide daily support to global military operations, essentially changing the very nature of this military element. This could have something to do with fewer people deciding to join the military as a reservist. But speaking of joining the military, which options do individuals have when considering enlistment in the U.S. military? The United States Armed Forces collectively manages 3 major service branches: the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, and the U.S. Navy. In addition to the 3 main military branches, the U.S. has 3 other notable military divisions: the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Space Force, and the U.S. Coast Guard. 5 of these branches are managed by the Department of Defense. The U.S. Coast Guard is the only exception, falling under the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security. But what exactly are these departments managing in 2024? Let's find out. First, let's get the numbers out of the way. Number 1 is the Army, the largest and oldest service in the U.S., with roughly 452,000 active duty soldiers. This is the smallest total the Army has been since 1940, a year before the U.S. joined World War II. In second place, we have the Navy, the U.S.'s forward deployed force. In 2024, this branch had approximately 347,000 active duty sailors. As with the Army, the U.S. generally isn't satisfied with the number, as it falls short of desired readiness levels and strategic objectives. Third-ranking branch is the Air Force, closely following the Navy with approximately 324,000 active duty personnel. The Department of Defense describes the Air Force as having rapid, flexible, and lethal air and space capability. Next up, the Marine Corps, a component of the Department of the Navy, which accounts for about 172,000 of the U.S.'s active duty personnel. This just leaves us with one more Department of Defense-controlled branch, the U.S. Space Force. Due to the unique nature of this branch, it shouldn't be surprising that it's by far the smallest, encompassing only about 9,400 active personnel. It also makes it the smallest branch in the U.S. military in general, as the Department of Homeland Security-managed Coast Guard has 41,700 active duty service members. However, the number of military personnel in each branch is just one aspect of their military might. The other, arguably even more important aspect, is the equipment and technology they possess. In this regard, we'll focus on 3 areas of attack. Let's look at U.S. land, air power, and naval power. We'll start with the U.S.'s might on the ground. Though it took some time, the U.S. ground forces have finally started departing from the Cold War-era thinking focused on containment. Slowly but surely, these forces are becoming significantly more agile and adaptable, reflecting the requirements of the modern battlefield. For this endeavor, the U.S. ground forces primarily rely on combat tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, and multiple launch rocket systems, so let's break down the U.S.'s capabilities in these departments. When it comes to tanks, the M1 Abrams continues to lead the way, making up for a good portion of the country's 4,657 tanks. This figure makes the U.S. the NATO country with the highest number of tanks. However, the same cannot be said for the world, as this position belongs to Russia, which has over 14,000 tanks. While Russia's main battle tank, the T-72, is far inferior to the U.S.'s Abrams tanks, the same cannot be said for the T-14 Armata, which was designed to rival and even surpass its Western counterparts' capabilities. Regarding infantry fighting vehicles, the widely respected M2 Bradley remains a cornerstone of the U.S. ground forces, providing formidable firepower and mobility. However, we mustn't forget about the Stryker armored vehicles that have allowed the U.S. ground forces to cover a myriad of battlefield roles with as many as 10 variants of this Canadian-made vehicle. So it's no wonder that some 10% of all U.S. infantry fighting vehicles are Stryker armored vehicles. These include 1,789 M1126 infantry carrier vehicles or ICVs, 545 M1127 reconnaissance vehicles or RVs, 441 M1129 mortar carriers MCs, 348 M1130 commanders vehicles or CVs, 304 M1133 medical evacuation vehicles or MEVs. The remainder of some 360,000 frontline, second line, and support vehicles are mostly wheeled types designed for urban fighting based on experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. This impressive figure also makes the U.S. the #1 country in the world in terms of infantry fighting vehicles, as they possess more than double these vehicles compared to the next countries on the list, China and Russia. Unfortunately, the U.S. artillery systems don't showcase the same superiority. Here we'll look at two artillery systems, self-propelled and towed. Both these systems have a pretty self-explanatory name. The former can move independently on tracks or wheels, while the latter requires a separate vehicle to position it on the battlefield. The U.S. operates an equal number of both these systems. It has almost 1,600 self-propelled guns, and almost all of them are M109 Paladin tracked vehicles. As for their towed counterparts, there are about 1,267 of them used by the U.S. military. Roughly 820 of those are the M777 howitzer-class systems operated by the Army and Marine Corps. This just leaves us with multiple launch rocket systems. These systems aim to provide rapid and widespread firepower against ground targets, typically using rockets or missiles launched from a mobile platform. The U.S. ground forces operate almost 700 of these handy systems, with the M142 HIMARS launcher making up more than a quarter of the total number. Now, it's time to take flight. How does the U.S. rank in terms of air power in 2024? The answer is simple. In the air, the U.S. is second to none. With over 13,000 service-available airframes, the U.S. maintains the world's most formidable air force with a diverse fleet of aircraft. So let's inspect this fleet in more detail. The U.S. Air Force is one of the few services worldwide that operates a dedicated bomber fleet with aircraft capable of both conventional and nuclear attacks. The standout bomber aircraft in this fleet include the B-1B Lancer as the backbone of the U.S.'s long-range bomber force. The Air Force operates 39 of those high-level bombers, which can carry the highest payload of 75,000 pounds. The B-2 Spirit, it's a multi-role bomber capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear warheads. Due to a high per-unit cost, only 21 of these aircraft are in the U.S. fleet, but the amount of firepower these units bring more than makes up for their modest number. The B-52 Stratofortress is a long-range heavy bomber that can fly at high subsonic speeds at altitudes of up to 50,000 feet. The U.S. force has used these bombers since the 1950s and operates 72 units. Next up, the U.S. Air Force's fighter aircraft fleet. These aircraft remain the frontline defenders for the U.S. Air Force, which operates as many as 1,854. Let's list the most notable among them. The F-15 Eagle is an all-weather, extremely maneuverable tactical fighter, represented by over 500 units. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a compact multi-role fighter that's relatively low cost. That last factor explains why the Air Force operates 775 of these fighters, the most of any model. The F-22 Raptor is a supersonic all-weather stealth fighter that can perform both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. The Air Force has 177 of these premier aircraft. The F-35A Lightning II The U.S. Air Force's latest fifth-generation fighter accounts for 310 units. Though these aircraft might be the first you think of, the U.S. Air Force fleet doesn't solely consist of aircraft designed to engage in combat or intercept other aircraft. It also includes aircraft designed for various other crucial missions, such as refueling, transport, and reconnaissance. Here are some of the more notable aircraft fulfilling these roles. First up, tanker aircraft, designed to extend the operational range of other aircraft. The U.S. Air Force has over 2,600 of these valuable aircraft, including the following: 388 KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling tankers, 61 KC-46A Pegasus aerial refueling and strategic military transport aircraft, 40 KC-10 Extender advanced tanker and cargo aircraft. As for transport aircraft, the U.S. Air Force operates over 950 units of the most diverse design, with the C-17 Globemaster III as the primary hauler with 228 units. Interestingly, this fleet also includes limited numbers of special aircraft designed to transport VIP individuals, such as U.S. leaders and high-ranking government and Department of Defense officials. So, for instance, there's only one C-20 and 4 C-32 aircraft. When it comes to reconnaissance, the following aircraft play a significant role: 13 MC-12W Liberty medium to low altitude twin-engine turboprop aircraft, 14 E-8C Joint Stars Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar Systems, and 26 U-2S Dragon Lady subsonic high-altitude spy planes. Finally, two more notable pieces of equipment to cover: helicopters and unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. The former category includes approximately 5,737 units, which are instrumental to the U.S. military. Due to their flexibility and tactical usefulness, these helicopters can be deployed to various missions, including search and rescue, medical evacuation, and special operations support. However, these rotorcraft units can also attack. The U.S. owns about 1,000 dedicated attack helicopters that can provide on-call fire support for ground forces, neutralize armored vehicles, or counter dug-in enemy force elements. Lastly, unmanned aerial vehicles. This is another area where the U.S. absolutely demolishes any competition. The country's armed services operates one of the largest UAV forces, with over 16,000 units. These drones are primarily intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance types, or ISR, but direct attack units are also included. Now that we covered the U.S.'s land and air power, let's dive into and explore the strength of the U.S. naval forces in 2024. By now, you probably won't be surprised to learn that these forces also beat out potential competitors by a considerable margin. Sure, with 472 vessels, the U.S. might not have the largest fleet in terms of size. However, the U.S. Navy boasts unmatched technological sophistication and operational capabilities, ensuring dominance in both traditional and asymmetric maritime warfare scenarios. The U.S. Navy also dominates the number game in areas where it matters the most on the sea: carriers. The U.S. currently has 11 carrier ships, which is more than all the other countries in the world combined. To be fair, 10 of these are the Nimitz-class nuclear-powered carriers that still utilize Cold War technologies to some extent. Still, they remain formidable assets, complemented by the newer, more advanced Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, which promises to take the U.S. military's naval capabilities to new heights. The U.S. is also number one in the helicopter carrier department, with 9 impressive warships. Even though these warships are smaller and less expensive to procure, other notable military forces are yet to keep up. Japan has the most helicopter carriers after the U.S., with only 4. But let's turn up the dramatics and discuss the more aggressive vessels in the Navy's fleet. And what better way to start than with destroyers? Destroyers are advanced multi-role vessels equipped with various sensory equipment, processing systems, and weaponry to counter threats from the air, the surface, and under the surface. These ships can operate independently of the main fleet when hunting enemy targets, often completing their missions with unbelievable precision. With all these characteristics in mind, you probably won't be surprised to hear destroyers are rather costly to procure and operate. That's why only a dozen countries in the world own destroyers, most of them operating only a few of these powerful vessels. Of course, the same can't be said for the U.S., which owns as many as 75 destroyer-type ships, the most in the world. Among those destroyers, 2 classes are represented: the Arleigh Burke class with 73 destroyers and the Zumwalt class with 2. Now, let's peek under the surface. There, you'll find an impressive fleet of attack submarines, combining Cold War relics with more modern and advanced entries. The first category is filled with vessels like the 26 Los Angeles class, 18 Ohio class, and 3 Seawolf class attack submarines. The second boasts 24 Virginia class submarines that are gradually replacing their older counterparts. Now, while we have to go underwater to view this display of naval might, it's important to know that these submarines can also conduct land attacks, some of them even through nuclear means. And don't get fooled by the name attack submarines, as these vessels can also be used for reconnaissance or to provide support during special forces operations. There are aspects of the naval fleet where the U.S. isn't the leading military force in the world. In fact, the U.S. doesn't even rank in the top 10 in some of them. But if you know anything about the country's determination, you know that this won't last for long. Take frigates, for example. Currently, the U.S. has 0 of these multi-role general-purpose vessels, which places it at the bottom of the 145 countries ranked by global firepower. Though keep in mind that the U.S. rarely uses frigates anymore. However, other powerful countries like Russia and China haven't followed suit. So the U.S. is getting back into the frigate game. The construction started in August 2022 after a 35-year break, and the USS Constellation, the lead class of these vessels, should enter service around 2026. Other areas where the U.S. Navy currently falls short are, number 1, the Corvette-type vessels, which are very similar to frigates. Currently, the Navy operates 23 of these small vessels, which is almost 4 times less than the first-ranking country, Russia. Number 2, the mine and counter-mine warfare ships that lay down or neutralize minefields in strategic waters. As of 2024, the Navy owns 8 of these vessels, a far cry from the 47 owned by the same country that owns the most corvettes, Russia. Finally, there's number 3, the Merchant Marine Force. During wartime, these vessels transport soldiers, supplies, and vehicles. The U.S. owns around 1,800 merchant vessels, so it doesn't even manage to crack the top 10 leading maritime nations. Still, these very few items in no way detract from the extraordinary military might that the U.S. possesses. By now, you should understand why this nation has consistently been ranked number 1 regarding overall military power and capability. All of this boils down to one vital question: how will the U.S. use its military might in 2024? There's a whole barrage of ongoing military operations that either involve the U.S. directly or through international organizations like the United Nations, the UN, the European Union, EU, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Here's a quick overview of the operations involving the U.S. in chronological order. Since 2004, the U.S. has been deploying drone strikes against Islamist militant groups in the war in northwest Pakistan. Since 2010, the same destiny has befallen Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and ISIS positions in Yemen, resulting from the effort to combat the Al-Qaeda insurgency in the country. In 2011, U.S. troops were sent to Uganda as advisors to assist in the fight against the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, and its leader, Joseph Kony. In 2014, the U.S. started interventions in Iraq and Syria, aiming to combat the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. In 2021, the U.S. continued its intervention in Somalia by conducting airstrikes on al-Shabaab militants. In 2023, Operation Prosperity Guardian was launched in order to counter the threat by Houthi forces in the Red Sea. Besides conducting specific operations, the U.S. troops are always stationed across different continents to maintain regional stability, provide security assistance to partner nations, conduct joint training exercises, or deter potential adversaries. So, as of 2024, the U.S. has over 100,000 service members in Europe, 30,000 throughout the Middle East, 375,000 in the Indo-Pacific region. From these numbers and the ongoing military operations, it's easy to conclude where the U.S. stands on most matters in terms of foreign policy. For instance, Europe received another 20,000 American soldiers after the Russo-Ukrainian War began in 2022 to enhance its military capabilities. Similarly, the sheer number of troops in the Indo-Pacific region makes it clear that the U.S. prioritizes the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which aims to uphold international norms and principles in the face of increasing assertiveness from countries like China. Did any of this information surprise you? For better or worse? Do you see any country surpassing the U.S. as the global military power anytime soon? In the early part of the Cold War, the United States had a serious problem. Gathering intelligence on the Soviet Union was proving incredibly difficult to do. Several attempts to establish intelligence networks behind the Iron Curtain had been violently put down, and a number of American and British spies, along with local collaborators, had met their ends at the hands of Soviet counterintelligence forces. Penetrating the Iron Curtain was proving all but impossible, and while the Americans were relatively new to the spy game, the Soviets were seasoned veterans that ran rings around the CIA. Gathering intelligence on Soviet nuclear weapons was critical. How many did they have? Where were they located? How fast could they be deployed? And what was their maximum range? In these early decades of the Cold War, the world hung on the edge of nuclear war, and knowing its enemy could prove to be the only thing that would save the United States, or at least mitigate the damage of an all-out nuclear exchange. Yet human operatives were routinely failing in their mission or winding up dead. Recognizing that they still had a lot to learn from their Soviet counterparts about spying, the US turned to the one area that it was superior to the Soviet Union in for an answer: technology. Immediately after World War II, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union all scrambled to get their hands on all the Nazi technology they could, along with their brilliant engineers and scientists. Given the United States liberal society and deep animosity between Germans and communists, most German scientists, however, opted to turn themselves into American authorities willingly, and the Soviets were largely forced to resort to kidnapping or threats to get their hands on high-value Germans. The influx of German talent to the US and the lure of American liberal culture to a world decimated by war and pitted between dictatorships and communist regimes helped bring other great minds to American shores, and soon the US was leapfrogging the Soviet Union technologically in several key areas. One of those areas was in the design of high-performance aircraft. While the Soviets were always the superior rocket scientists, American talent for aircraft was unmatched anywhere in the world. One of those minds, the legendary Kelly Johnson, would bring the world the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world. Putting his mind to the United States' intelligence gathering problem, Johnson went to work on a spy plane with the endurance to overfly the Soviet Union and photograph Soviet military bases, then return this critical intelligence for analysis. Not only had the Soviets fallen behind in aircraft and jet engine design, they'd also fallen behind in the development of radar technology. Knowing this, Johnson developed the U-2 spy plane, a slow but extremely high-flying plane that could fly over much of the Soviet Union and remain completely out of reach of Soviet fighter planes and missiles both. Taking flight for the first time in 1955, the U-2 soon proved its worth as it boldly flew into Soviet airspace, en route from West Germany to photograph the submarine base in Leningrad. As the U-2 slowly tracked its way across international waters and began to penetrate Soviet airspace, American officials waited with bated breath. Soviet radar may have been less advanced than American radar, but even their ground stations would have easily detected the incoming U-2 from dozens of miles away. Intercepted radio communications told U.S. officials that Soviet interceptors were in the air and rapidly approaching the incoming U-2. Flying at just a few hundred miles an hour and equipped with zero weapons, the U-2 was utterly defenseless. Flying at 70,000 feet, the Americans were alarmed when it became clear that not only had the Soviet radar spotted the U-2, but had actually been able to intermittently track its course. This was a stunning revelation to American planners, who had believed that Soviet radar would be unable to accurately track such a high-flying target for any amount of time. Not only was this assumption now clearly false, but in fact turned out that the Soviet radar may have actually been a little better than American radar. Worried officials nevertheless approved the continuation of the mission, and the U-2 continued to fly toward its target in Leningrad. Though unable to accurately track the U-2 for long, Soviet ground stations nonetheless were able to guide interceptors toward the U-2. Unable to do anything about the incoming fighters, the U-2's pilot stayed on course, his faith in the assurance granted him by Kelly Johnson, the man behind the U-2. MiG-17s were soon within range, and their pilots pitched their noses up to gain the altitude needed to successfully fire on the helpless American plane. Yet their planes only had a service ceiling of 54,000 feet, and their inferior air-to-air missiles couldn't bridge the gap to the U-2. One by one, the Soviet planes climbed only to stall out as their engines flared out and then tumble out of the sky. Having avoided the MiG threat, Soviet air defense stations received an order to fire on the American plane. Within minutes, a half-dozen surface-to-air missiles rose screaming into the air, gunning directly for a plane so fragile that a too steep turn would rip the wings off the fuselage. Yet, as with the MiGs, the U-2 was too high up to touch, and Soviet missiles expended all of their fuel trying to reach 70,000 feet, and then fell to Earth. The U-2 was a success, and the US could now overfly the Soviet Union to gather critical intelligence on everything from number of bombers to missile silos with complete impunity. The Kremlin was furious, and if they were mad about the multiple U-2 incursions throughout the mid-50s, then they were even more angry when an American U-2 flew directly over Moscow. So many interceptors were being sent to try and shoot down the American planes that the photographs the U-2 took were often littered with Soviet aircraft tumbling out of the sky. The US restricted the flights of the U-2, not wishing to risk a provocation to war. The Americans believed that the Soviets would simply accept that they could not stop the U-2, and while they lodged many diplomatic complaints, they never publicly acknowledged the incursions on the world stage for fear of international embarrassment. American assumptions about the Soviets would prove terribly wrong, however, when on May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile brought down a U-2 on a mission over the Soviet Union. The Soviets had caught up to American technology and, in a matter of a few short years, dramatically improved their missile technology, and yet the US still desperately needed the critical intelligence that the U-2 had offered. With this intelligence, America had an unparalleled strategic advantage over the Soviet Union and knew the layout of its military forces almost as well as the Soviets did themselves. The shooting down of the American U-2 was now an official intelligence disaster, and the US needed a solution. Already in development before the shoot-down of the U-2 in 1960, Kelly Johnson redoubled his efforts on the development of a brand new spy plane. The Soviets proved they could track and shoot down a U-2, so Johnson's answer was simple: we'll just go faster than their missiles. A lot faster. Johnson had for a few years been working on a new ultra-secret prototype airplane. Jet fighters and bombers were still a relatively new development, having been operational in significant numbers for about a decade, and now Johnson was designing a jet-powered plane that was decades ahead of anything else in the sky. Experimenting with a few variants for different mission types, Johnson's secret and very futuristic plane finally settled on a role as a reconnaissance aircraft, and the first SR-71 took to the sky on December 22, 1964. On its first flight, the plane reached an incredible speed of Mach 3.4, and it immediately became apparent that the US had the tool it desperately needed to keep tabs on the Soviets. 4 years later, the SR-71 flew its first operational sortie, penetrating into North Vietnam and revealing hidden Vietnamese bases. 2 weeks later, American forces had destroyed them. The SR-71 continued to fly deep into North Vietnam, and soon the North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors grew wise to the airspace incursions. Not a true stealth aircraft, the SR-71 nonetheless had stealthy features designed to make it more difficult to spot and successfully track. The first incursions into North Vietnam were disregarded by the Vietnamese radar operators and their Soviet advisors as being artifacts or equipment malfunctions. Nothing in the world could be flying at that high and that fast to be real. Yet the SR-71 was very real, and flying at 3 times the speed of sound from an incredible altitude of 80,000 feet. After several of these radar glitches, it was clear that something was going on in the skies above North Vietnam. The damned Americans were at it again. On July 26, 1968, Vietnamese air defense stations tracked an incoming SR-71. The problem for ground radar was that the plane was fast, blazingly fast. And this fact, combined with stealthy characteristics of its design, meant that by the time the radar contact was made, it was typically too late to fire a missile. Nevertheless, on this day the Vietnamese tried, firing Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles at the incoming plane. The crew was immediately alerted by their missile warning indicator and followed standard missile avoidance protocol: go faster. The plane accelerated to about Mach 3.3, and the crew held their breaths. Would Kelly Johnson's plane truly outfly a supersonic missile? In moments, they had their answer, and Flight 976 went on its way completely unharmed. On their return journey back to base, they overflew the same SAM site and were fired on again to the same effect. Later analysis of the terrain tracking camera footage revealed that the nearest missile had exploded a full mile behind the big black plane. The SR-71 could officially outfly missiles. Soon, SR-71 flights took place over the Soviet Union itself, and frustrated Soviet officials found themselves in the same position they were back in the late 50s. All of their secrets lay bare and exposed for the Americans to photograph from the sky, and they were utterly helpless to stop them. Salvos of SAMs were fired at the incoming planes, but each time the pilot simply stepped on the gas and outran the missiles. To avoid interception, the SR-71 was equipped with a radar jammer, which would make it difficult to lock onto the plane once in range. This difficulty was further compounded by the stealthy features of the big plane's body,
and together effectively lowered tracking and target acquisition range to just a few dozen miles. Even at these ranges though, a radar on the ground may spot the SR-71 but would not have a high enough resolution lock to successfully guide missiles to target. The incredible speed of the SR-71 then allowed it to simply blaze over the surface-to-air installation, and any missiles fired would spend all their energy on just reaching the 80,000-foot altitude the plane flew at, and then simply fall back to Earth. Soviet interceptors proved no better at the job than their surface-to-air batteries did. Most of them simply lacked the ability to even get high enough to threaten the SR-71 in the first place. To solve the issue and to counter the threat of secret American supersonic bomber programs, Soviet designers created the MiG-25. In essence, the MiG-25 was nothing more than a rocket with wings, and included very few avionics. Despite being highly touted by the Soviets, the reality was that the plane could operate only as an interceptor, and even then, it had an effective combat radius of under 200 miles. The max operating altitude of the plane was just below the SR-71, which in theory would allow for interception, but the plane could not fly faster than Mach 2.5 or it would destroy its engines. The only hope for a MiG-25 to intercept the SR-71 would be if it somehow managed to get an early enough warning to line up a head-on shot at the SR-71. And even then, its missiles would fail to compensate for the incredible closing rate of the SR-71 and had no hope of hitting it. When the MiG-25 proved ineffective, the Soviets doubled down and developed the MiG-31. A vastly improved interceptor, the MiG-31 had much greater range and operational altitude, and was theoretically capable of intercepting an SR-71. In fact, at least a dozen peaceful intercepts near Soviet airspace were carried out during the 1980s, and all of these when Washington had hoped to improve relations with the Soviet Union by ceasing operations inside its airspace. These intercepts led many to believe that the SR-71 had met its match. Yet in reality, even the MiG-31 was unlikely to intercept an SR-71 except in the most favorable conditions, and even then it would need quite a bit of luck. In order for the MiG-31 to successfully intercept the SR-71, it would require the coordination of several aircraft to cover all approach vectors, thus increasing the odds that at least one would be at the right incoming direction for the SR-71. The MiG-31 would still stall out trying to get to the same altitude as an SR-71, and typically would only get within 10,000 feet, not nearly close enough for a guaranteed missile intercept. Only by being directly in the path of an incoming SR-71 could the MiG-31 hope to shoot one down, and even then it was doubtful. The extreme altitude meant that any missiles fired would have a very difficult time maneuvering, as they rely on fins to adjust their course as they fly through the air. The very low temperatures also affected the proximity fuses on the missiles, and made it unlikely that it would detonate in time to damage the aircraft. On top of this, the SR-71 itself was armed with defensive countermeasures that included jammers, and the low radar reflectivity only confounded problems for an incoming missile. The most optimal launch envelope for an enemy fighter would actually be to get directly behind the SR-71, where heat-seeking missiles could lock onto the engines. But again, with the MiG-31 unable to keep up with the SR-71's speed, this was an extremely unlikely thing to happen. Even the peacetime intercepts that the MiG-31 carried out on the SR-71 were only ever truly possible because the SR-71's flight route was well known to the Soviets. Had the SR-71 truly wanted to penetrate Soviet airspace, it would have taken an unpredictable approach vector, and it would have been up to blind luck for the MiGs to be in the right place to take their shot. In the end, the SR-71 served America faithfully for over 30 years, and despite over 1,000 missiles fired at it, not a single SR-71 was ever lost to hostile action. Many myths abound over its retirement in the 1990s, with most people believing that advances in Russian interceptors and missiles put the SR-71 at risk, or that spy satellites were able to do the job of an SR-71 and it was no longer needed. These assumptions are both tacitly false, as there still doesn't exist a plane that is truly capable of ensuring a successful interception of an SR-71. And while useful, spy satellites can take up to 24 hours to get over a target area and have a predictable route in the sky, which allows an enemy to hide whatever they don't want seen when the satellite is overhead. In truth, the SR-71 was canceled due to shifting budget priorities by US lawmakers. In a world without the Soviet Union, few believed that the SR-71 was necessary anymore, and budgets increasingly went to the development of the B-2 bomber and UAVs. Today, though, with the rise of China and Russia's renewed belligerence, a successor to the SR-71 is now in testing and is rumored to hit speeds as high as Mach 6. Without a doubt, the finest aerospace engineer in history, Kelly Johnson designed and built the world's greatest spy plane. And even today, decades after his death, the SR-71 remains unparalleled in capability.
Guns, tanks, stealth jets, and lasers? The US military has a pretty advanced army, and buried in those vaults are some of the strangest weapons ever invented. Here are the craziest military weapons the Army still uses today. Number 20. Atchison Assault Shotgun. Everyone knows the positives of a shotgun. They hit like a tank, complete with an earth-shattering sound. The cons? Very limited capacity. That makes it useful for scaring off a daughter's boyfriend or blowing the head off a zombie, but maybe not so much in combat. Military weapons require both accuracy, ease of use, and high capacity, not something shotguns are typically known for. Enter the Atchison. Also known as the Auto Assault 12, this gun is one of the only automatic combat shotguns ever created. It only needs the user to make a quick trigger pull to fire and can fire up to a whopping 300 shots a minute. While this model was designed in the 1980s and has largely fallen out of favor, future designs built on it and combat shotguns are still used today. Making them even more useful, the powerful recoil that comes with a shotgun, knocking many an unexpected user off their feet, is barely present here. It takes the power of a shotgun and combines it with the accuracy and use of a rifle. But sometimes the best way to survive combat is not to be seen. Number 19. Adaptive Camouflage. It's hard to get a convoy through enemy territory. One wrong move and you could come under attack from dozens of snipers. And staying under the radar is easier when you're not taking massive military vehicles with you. Camouflage has been used by militaries for thousands of years, often as simple as the color of clothing soldiers wear. But disguising something large like a tank is a different story. In 2011, that all changed as BAE Systems announced an incredible new program that could protect convoys from enemy eyes. But could someone really make a tank invisible? Surprisingly, yes. The adaptive camouflage system was simply surprisingly effective. The sides of the armored vehicle would be covered with around 1,000 hexagonal panels that would take thermal images of everything around the vehicle. They would then reflect what was on the other side, creating an image of an area without the vehicle in it. Alternatively, the camouflage could reflect a chosen image, like a harmless car driving through, to eliminate suspicion. The infrared stealth system remains one of the top choices for high-tech camouflage available today. Sometimes what an army needs is strength. Number 18. Hulk. No, they're not dropping a green giant guy on the enemy, although that would be pretty effective. The Human Universal Load Carrier was an attempt by Berkeley Robotics starting in the year 2000 to see what a human can do when given a little assistance. Carrying equipment is one of the biggest challenges of the Army, and it often makes it hard to travel from one location to another. So, the scientists asked, what if we could increase a soldier's carrying capacity? By how much? How about an inhuman 200 pounds while traveling 10 miles an hour? And all it would take was a simple exoskeleton. The Hulk was designed to fit around the legs and back, providing support and a powered assist while carrying a massively heavy backpack. Powered by batteries, it would run for up to 8 hours while marching and could operate for days with lighter use. While it did perform up to par for weight and none of the troops using it were injured by the weights, the Army wasn't quite satisfied with the freedom of movement it offered, and it could cause strain on muscles. While it's not currently used in combat, interest in the project remains, bringing us all a little bit closer to being Iron Man. In combat, the most important factor is none other than accuracy. Number 17. Precision-guided firearm. In today's Army, many of the soldiers are trained marksmen, but many only get basic training. And in the event of a draft, it's likely some would be thrown into combat with only a few weeks of training. That's why today's military is focused on how to take a little of the work off the soldier and onto the gun itself. The precision-guided firearm is an upgraded sniper rifle that not only has the traditional tracking scope, but comes with wireless smart technology to pick up data to make it easier to hit your target. And when we say pick up data, we mean all of the data. The most advanced of all these weapons can hack into a local and larger network to pick up data from voice and video all around. The digital scope can also provide visual assistance for locking onto the target, similar to how fighter jets often have precise targeting mechanisms. If this sounds like super spy territory, that's because it is, and many of these weapons can track targets and figure out the best possible vantage point to hit them from, without much input from the man behind the scope. But what if it wasn't just the gun that was smart? Number 16. Smart bullets. Precision-guided munitions are not new. Missiles and torpedoes are often equipped with guiding mechanisms that can not only just lock onto targets but change their trajectory if the target moves. In 2008, the Exacto program at DARPA switched their strategy from focusing solely on smart guns, developing bullets that can have the same abilities. The earliest model would illuminate the target with a laser designator, and the bullet would be keyed to follow that. It would be able to track targets up to a mile away and change position 30 times a second. But modern designs might be even more advanced. The research into smart bullets is ongoing, and Dr. Roland Barrett developed a model that would have 3 fiber optic eyes around it for tracking. Other designed bullets would be able to be controlled by radio waves or travel around corners automatically without needing to be fired from a curved barrel. These weapons are still in development, and the biggest roadblock in their way? Money. After all, most soldiers will only use one gun, but a lot of bullets, and making every one of them a smart bullet would involve a lot of technology. Maybe time to send those bullets through community college instead. Sometimes, though, you need non-lethal weapons. Number 15. Taser Shockwave. A stun gun can be a useful way to neutralize an enemy without killing or seriously hurting them, like when you need them coherent for interrogation. But that becomes a lot harder when the person is part of a large group of enemies, and they're all coming right at you. They're probably going to overwhelm you before you get the chance to fire the taser more than once, and that's if you don't run out of charge. But what if you could fire 10 tasers at one time? That's the question the mad scientists at the Taser Corporation decided to answer, and the resulting weapon was amazing, if not exactly practical. Meet the Taser Shockwave, a battery of stun guns attached to cables and loaded into a launcher. When triggered, the tasers shoot out and deliver powerful shocks to just about anyone they hit. It might look like a many-headed dragon, but it's effective at incapacitating attackers quickly and in large numbers, if it hits the target. Accuracy isn't really its strong suit, and in a combat situation, there's no guarantee it would hit its target. Taser continues to refine the weapon, and some think it might be more suited to crowd control than combat. And sometimes, you need weapons in the most unusual circumstances. Number 14. Heckler & Koch P11. You're on a submarine, and you get an alert. A saboteur is trying to sink you. You get into the water to engage, but there is just one problem. Your gun isn't equipped for firing underwater. Ordinary rounds lose range and accuracy when fired underwater. Fortunately, you're armed with the Heckler & Koch P11, one of the best underwater pistols ever developed. It's short and stubby, looking more like a checkout scanner than a gun, but it packs a punch. But the surface isn't the only thing that makes it different. The P11 only has 5 barrels as opposed to the usual 6. It fires steel darts rather than traditional bullets, but they can still tear through the enemy. And rather than being traditionally fired, it uses a battery pack in the grip. Also, don't use it recklessly. It can't be reloaded by users and has to be returned to the factory for more ammo. This isn't a weapon that's used too often unless we wind up fighting an army from the lost city of Atlantis, but its secrets are well kept. So well, in fact, its manufacturer won't comment on it. Sometimes the military goes small, and sometimes they go big. Number 13. Electromagnetic Laboratory Railgun. The U.S. Office of Naval Research is not a place you get into easily. This is where all the prototypes of the most advanced weapons in the military stable can be found. But one of them has the potential to be one of the deadliest weapons ever created, taking an already powerful tool and supercharging it with modern technology. A railgun is a massive weapon that fires projectiles at rapid speed and would be one of the most powerful weapons in the U.S. arsenal without needing the equipment for traditional firing. So what is the secret of this massive prototype? Instead of chemicals designed to ignite explosions, this railgun would fire projectiles entirely using magnetic fields and electricity, and they would travel faster and hit harder than any bullet currently available, up to a whopping 5,600 miles per hour. This gives the railgun power associated with cruise missiles. It's currently in testing, and the military is optimistic about mounting it on ships soon enough. But to get there, they'll have to perfect the repeated fire capability, because for this gun, it's both quantity and quality, and that means a lot more tests. But what if the military didn't need to use humans at all? Number 12. The Fire Scout. When troops are in a pitched firefight and they see a helicopter from up above, it usually means one thing: backup is here. But the powerful defense contractor Northrop Grumman has given a new twist. The helicopter is here to provide support, but that doesn't mean there's anyone on board. The Fire Scout looks almost exactly like a standard military chopper, but you'll see a few differences. For one thing, it doesn't have windows, because there's no one inside to look out of them. The Fire Scout might be the most advanced drone ever created. It can take off and land independently, provide aerial fire support for ground troops, and has a top-of-the-line targeting system. While it's designed to be used in combat, it's also an effective surveillance tool. It was declared mission-capable in 2019 and took to the skies, although the Navy continues to develop and enhance it. This raises the question: if the smart machines are the wave of the future, which other heavy artillery could soon be roaming the battlefield without any soldiers on board? Naturally, we're about to find out. Number 11. The Black Knight. Tanks are the workhorse of the military. These treaded vehicles provide valuable shelter for soldiers, run over enemy lines, and are equipped with powerful guns. There's just one downside.
If they take a hard hit, they can be hard to escape from in a hurry, which is why the mad geniuses of BAE Systems asked, what if we had a tank without the vulnerable people inside? Enter the Black Knight, a 12-ton tank designed as an unmanned ground combat vehicle. It looks like an ordinary tank on the surface, but much like the Fire Scout, looks can be deceiving. Let's just say you don't want to be in the way of this drone. It's armed with both a turret-mounted large gun and a coaxial machine gun, runs on traditional Caterpillar diesel engines, and its tractor treads make it ideal for off-road operations. It's operated by remote control, but also can use its computer system to make in-combat decisions, independently of operator input. While it's ideal for missions that are too dangerous to send soldiers into the field, its technology is still a work in progress as the military tries to perfect the wireless communication system. But many people in power think this is the remote tank that might be the wave of the future. The military has developed many non-lethal weapons, some with a devastating impact. Number 10. Phaser. It looks like a sci-fi laser gun, and it kinda acts like it too. The Phaser, officially titled the Personnel Halting and Stimulation Response Rifle, is a massive laser dazzler gun designed by the Air Force's Research Division. It doesn't fire a projectile, but can neutralize an entire field of enemies in seconds by unleashing a massive burst of light that can temporarily blind them. This is a low-intensity laser, which means that the victim should recover quickly, but it can leave an entire field of soldiers stumbling among each other and firing nowhere in particular. So why is this weapon not everywhere yet? It's not that the gun didn't work, it's that the military had to make sure it didn't work too well. Blinding weapons that can cause permanent damage are banned under a 1995 UN protocol, and using them is seen as a crime against humanity, so the military needed to make sure there were no lasting side effects. They also had to give it a really cool name, and someone in the design process was definitely a Star Trek fan. But unlike its namesake weapon, this one only has a stun setting. This next weapon might be the way out of some close quarters. Number 9. The Corner Shot. In the 1940s, the Nazi army debuted a new weapon, the Krumlauf, a rifle with a curved barrel that could shoot around corners. It was an innovative solution to a major combat problem, and it was a complete failure, with the bullets getting jammed and damaging the barrel after only a few shots. But over 50 years later, the design might have been perfected, ironically by an Israel weapons designer named Amos Golan. Designed in cooperation with American investors, the Corner Shot has become a key tool for modern militaries. But technology has marched on since the 1940s, and it shows. Unlike the failed version, this weapon doesn't try to shoot a bullet through a curved barrel. Instead, it mounts to a small pistol on the end of a larger weapon, allowing it to be aimed at the target that can be seen through a periscope lens. And it's not a high-powered weapon, but it's one that makes shooting targets from the safety of cover much easier. And in case you're looking for a little more firepower, it can be equipped with a 40mm grenade launcher that can send rounds flying in any direction you choose, without the risk of blowing up your own barrel. Sometimes it's not about the firepower you pack, but it's about what you see. Number 8. IVAS. Soldiers can be armed with the best weapons in the world, but in the fog of war, they're dependent on their own eyesight. If they're caught in smoke or in a snowstorm, their aim might be off, leading to missed targets or worse, friendly fire casualties. This gets even more dangerous when the enemy releases vision-clouding weapons, letting them get the drop on the soldiers, which is why teams in the United States Army are working on a unique new headset, one that will not just clear their vision, but plunge the soldiers into a new world. Are our soldiers ready for virtual reality? The Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS, is an augmented reality headset that eliminates visual fog and provides soldiers with a unique array of image options. This includes a thermal setting, so soldiers will be able to see hidden enemies. It also can filter out interference and let soldiers focus on what's important. The headset is in final testing, and the Army plans to use it both as a field tool and a training tool, with soldiers able to engage against virtual enemies in the headset. Maybe exclusive headset video games will soon make some pro gamers sign up for the service too. It's not the only field where the military is working on what sounds like science fiction. Number 7. Quantum Stealth. Guy Kramer comes from Canadian innovation royalty, being the grandson of the man who invented the first walkie-talkie. But he might be looking to outdo his granddad by cracking a concept H.G. Wells invented in fiction over a century ago. How do you turn someone invisible? The military has been working on a vehicle camouflage for a while, but options for mobile soldiers are much limited. That's where quantum stealth comes into play, a long-term project between Kramer's company Hyperstealth and military officials in both Canada and the USA. So what's the secret to his
military's innovation? The keys to quantum stealth are being kept close to the military's chest, but what we know is the quantum stealth uses lenticular lenses, the same technology seen in 3D movie posters. The lenses refract light according to the angle they're viewed at, and the way that they're arranged creates dead spots where the object isn't visible. But the background is. While it doesn't render the subject completely invisible and can create a blurry spot, it's more than effective enough to confuse a soldier observing from a distance. So it's no surprise the government is investing heavily in the technology. But sometimes you need an earth-shattering kaboom. Number 6. XN1 Laws. Unleash the death ray. Laser weapons are part of science fiction lore, but the US government doesn't want to destroy any planets with them, we hope. The advantage of lasers is that they use a simple powered device and don't rely on ammunition, so they can deliver more than one hit in quick succession. The XN1 Laws was developed by the US Navy and first deployed for field testing in 2014, and the USS Ponce was the lucky ship to get to fire it first. It uses an infrared beam launched from a laser array to hit flying and sea-based targets. So, how does it work? For one thing, it's highly energy efficient, needing only an energy pulse to fire and none of the equipment. It can also be adjusted for power, being useful for temporarily blinding enemies at the lowest level. But when it's dialed up to the maximum level of 30,000 watts, it can deliver a massive punch. Not only can it target motors and fry sensors, but it can detonate explosive material on an enemy boat before it reaches its target. It might not be able to blow up enemy battleships from afar, but it's the most effective laser weapon yet. And when it comes to non-lethal tech, sometimes things get weird. Number 5. LED Incapacitator. The enemy is advancing, and the only thing that will defeat them is a flashlight? Well, not just any flashlight. The LED Incapacitator is one of the oddest weapons designed by the Department of Homeland Security's Innovation Research Office, and it's largely designed for use at border crossings and other locations where confrontations with suspicious individuals who might be carrying contraband are likely. Rather than using a traditional weapon, this weapon unleashes a series of random pulses of multicolored light, which switch frequencies often and cause pressure on the brain, and the effects can be messy. The first symptom is a severe headache, and subjects can experience temporary blindness because their eyes can't adjust to the flashing lights. But they also can't focus, become disoriented, and are hit with a wave of nausea, which is why this weapon has earned the nickname the Puke Ray. It's largely an effective weapon against individual targets, but some subjects have been proven largely immune. While it hasn't been deployed everywhere due to concerns over its effectiveness, the odds are it would at least be a useful distractor. But that's nothing compared to what this next non-lethal weapon does. Number 4. Active Denial System. The U.S. military and defense contractor Raytheon wanted a way to maintain perimeter security and crowd control without having to rely on live fire, and they developed an option that comes out of science fiction. Known as the ADS, it works by firing an energy beam of similar wavelength to the way a microwave oven works. But instead of heating up your frozen burrito, the ADS is going to heat up you. It activates the water and fat molecules in the skin, suddenly heating them and creating a painful effect that sends anyone hit with it running. But surely, microwaving people can't be ethical, right? While the technology is scary, the effects have been minimal. A microscopic percentage of those affected develop minor burns and blistering, while most retreat from the painful sensation without suffering any obvious injuries. While the device could seriously hurt someone if focused on them, the device is intended to protect perimeters and deter people from entering, meaning they'll have the option to run away as soon as they feel the heat. Authorities are now exploring deploying it in both theaters of war and as a way to keep prisoners from escaping over the fence. This next weapon raises the question, is James Bond becoming real? Number 3. The Armatix IP-1. This weapon doesn't look like much. It's just a standard handgun. But if the agent carrying it gets attacked and disarmed, the enemy grabs their gun, they'll be in for an unpleasant surprise. Because it doesn't matter how many bullets are in the chamber, that gun is not firing. The Armatix IP-1, developed by a famous German firearms manufacturer, is notable for being one of the most advanced smart guns in the world. Not only is it optimized to be safe and easy to fire and equipped with a camera, but it can only be fired by its authorized user, and it pulls that off with an unassuming accessory. The Armatix IP-1 comes in 2 parts, the gun and the wristwatch it's linked to. It might look like a standard accessory, but it's actually an RFID system that communicates with a handgun and can wirelessly affect it when within 10 inches. If the gun is separated from the watch wearer, it becomes a paperweight. This is one watch battery you don't want to run out, so it indicates the charge on both parts, and it comes with a targeting system that can identify and only fire toward the assigned target. It's not a surprise that this gun is not only being considered for classified missions, but many people want some of its features added to standard guns. But what's the ultimate frontier in combat? It just might be droids. Number 2. Modular Advanced Armed Robotic System. What's better than armed combat vehicle drones? How about an armed robotic soldier that can head into battle instead of humans? We might be a long way from the cyborg wars, but that hasn't stopped the Defense Department from dreaming big. They've been experimenting with combat robots for a while, and the current models are more advanced than ever. Coming soon to a battlefield near you, the Mars, a nearly 400-pound robot armed with sensors, weapons, and cameras, and it's packing more firepower than any human could carry. How much? How about a machine gun? 4 grenade launchers, the capability to fire non-lethal gear like tear gas, as well as laser dazzler and a loudspeaker for communicating safely with the enemy. For non-combat missions, the Mars can be equipped with the ability to carry up to 120 pounds. While some combat robots are designed for artificial intelligence, the Mars is more analog, controlled by an operator at base like a drone. But it doesn't need to be a smart robot, it's got enough brawn to make up for the brains. But there's one more robot in the field that might take you by surprise and make you say, "What a good boy." Number 1. Robot dogs. A battlefield is stressful enough, but imagine seeing a large 4-legged animal approaching you. It looks kind of like a dog, but the proportions are off and it's moving fast. This isn't some weird desert beast, it's one of the military's most popular innovations, the Big Dog. This 4-legged military robot was developed by Boston Dynamics and DARPA in 2005 for equipment carrying purposes, essentially replacing the pack mules of old. Its 4-legged system would let it overcome rough terrain, and each one would have a complex onboard computer. But sometimes reality defeats innovation. The Big Dog project didn't work out for carrying military equipment because they were too loud for combat. Turns out all those moving parts aren't quiet. But this wasn't the end of the project. While the original shut down in 2015, a smaller all-electric model with a lower carrying capacity was soon introduced. And many current models are being equipped not just with carrying capacity, but with non-lethal defense capabilities. That means these robot dogs have a bite, and they might just be coming to a city near you. Military has been protecting Americans for hundreds of years, and it's developed a lot of secrets in its time. Here are 50 surprising facts about the US military. Number 50. Older than you know. The country's first business after being founded would probably be to create a military, right? Well, in the United States they didn't have to, since they already had one. About 13 months before the United States declared independence, the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution creating a United Continental Army. It would be led by George Washington, and that army was trained in preparation for increasingly likely hostilities with the British Crown. So at least in this country, the US Army is older than the United States, and it's grown a lot since then. Number 49. Bigger than you know. The military is run today by the US Department of Defense, and it's laid its claim to a large swath of land. It controls federal land in the US, land it leases abroad, and land the US government has claimed as territory in past military engagements. Altogether, that comes to around 30 million acres of land worldwide. Not only is that larger than the state of Pennsylvania, but if all combined, it would be larger than all but 99 countries. And it's a path to success. Number 48. Honored men. You'd think that most people who would become US presidents probably grew up in the elites, and they might be less likely to serve. But actually, around 2/3 of the men who became US presidents were US military veterans, starting with the very first, George Washington. The most decorated was probably Theodore Roosevelt, who even received the Medal of Honor. Ulysses S. Grant and Dwight D. Eisenhower were probably the most renowned generals in the Civil War and World War II. But we're in a dry spell right now. Of the last 5 presidents, only 1 served in the military, and George W. Bush only served stateside in the Air National Guard, and it came from humble beginnings. Number 47. No, not guerrillas. During the first days of the military, the US Army didn't have much to work with. They were ill-equipped, only had a short time to train, and were facing one of the world's largest empires. But they had one advantage. They were on their home turf, and they knew how to use it. General Francis Marion took full advantage of the swampy terrain and used it for the surprise attacks against unsuspecting British patrols. The US soldiers would emerge from the swamp, attack, and just as quickly retreat, rather than engaging, a tactic that would become the blueprint for modern guerrilla warfare. But today it's spread pretty thin. Number 46. All over the place. There are 195 recognized countries in the world, and the US military is present in over 2/3 of them. The US military's 3 million current employees, 450,000 of those are soldiers deployed to foreign countries. But the US isn't involved in any current war since we withdrew from Afghanistan. So what exactly are we doing there? It's complicated. While in some countries the US is engaged in active operations against terror groups, in others they've been invited as peacekeepers or to maintain a presence as a deterrent. The US also has permanent military bases on the soil of many other allies that coordinate with other militaries. But what happens when the US is considering leaving? Number 45. Cash cow. For many years, budget-conscious politicians and activists in the US wondered, why does the US still have military bases in places like Europe? After all, that's not exactly a military flashpoint anymore. Okay, that take aged pretty poorly. But people still wondered if bases in places like Germany were worth the investment. Well, if you ask the Germans, they were. When word got out that the US was considering closing bases in some locations, the locals were strongly opposed. The local economy was heavily based around the presence of United States soldiers, and they didn't want to face a budget crunch. And the US military has had a lot of mouths to feed. Number 44. Top of the heap. The top employer in the United States, it's not ExxonMobil, the largest energy company, which has just under 1 million employees. It's not even Walmart, the mega-sized shopping chain which has 1.3 million. It's the United States Department of Defense, which in addition to all the active duty and reserve soldiers, maintains enough civilian personnel to have a whopping total staff of 3 million people. And unlike many businesses, it's going to be around as long as the US is, so that's a lot of job security, and it keeps on growing. Number 43. Recruits welcome. Each year, the military takes in around 79,000 new recruits. The U.S. Army alone has more people in it than major cities like San Francisco, and it's only one of the 5 branches, with the smaller Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, and Marines joining in. Today, all 5 branches of the military are volunteer-only, with recruits getting details on their pay rate and all the potential benefits they'll get after they complete their term. Many people's first exposure to the military is at recruitment fairs, where they often make it sound like an awesome adventure. But it wasn't always this way. Number 42. Anyone feel a draft? For the U.S. military's first 80 years, it was also mostly an all-volunteer force, and it was capable of winning both the American Revolution and the British revenge strike in the War of 1812. But then came the Civil War, and the U.S. was split in two, as the Confederacy took a lot of the military's manpower with it. Soon, both armies were instituting the U.S.'s first military draft, requiring people to sign up under penalty of law. It didn't go over well. Many people were angry about how some were able to buy their way out of the draft, and it led to bloody riots in New York City. But it worked, and the draft would be brought back for the 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam. But it wasn't the only time young men had to check the mail nervously. Number 41. A draft just in case. The first peacetime draft was created in 1940, but was it really peacetime? Everyone knew that World War II would likely make its way over to the United States eventually, and Pearl Harbor proved them right. But the second peacetime draft was more controversial. Passed in 1948, it wasn't as widespread, but it deployed countless young men around the world just in case they were needed when hostilities with the Soviet Union broke out. There was no formal declaration of war, but many men drafted under the law wound up in Korea or Vietnam. And there was no allowance for celebrities. If your number came up, you had to serve, even if you were Elvis. Number 40. The King in fatigues. When the King was drafted in 1958, there was no war going on, something his millions of fans were no doubt happy about. He insisted he didn't want to be treated any differently than the average soldier, despite the mob of fans waiting for him as he arrived at boot camp. He served as a private, did his duty quietly, and chose not to apply for a transfer to special services, where he could have given concerts as part of his service. His label was prepared. They had stockpiled musical material before his induction, and his fans would barely notice he was in the Army now. But one group wasn't allowed in the Army until recently. Number 39. Women's Day. Women have been aiding the military since the beginning, but often in limited roles or with many roadblocks in their way. A disguised woman, Deborah Sampson, even became a decorated Revolutionary War veteran. But women weren't allowed to join the military until 1948. Before that, many served unofficially as spies, nurses, or support staff, but weren't eligible for honors despite being in as much danger as the armed soldiers. Since then, though, the laws have changed and now women are eligible to serve in all combat roles. There is, however, one exception. Number 38. Selective indeed. The draft has been off the table since the 1970s, and the military does not want it back. However, all males between 18 and 25 are still required to register for selective service, which means if a draft is needed, it can be snapped into action and people can be pulled into the military in only days. However, it doesn't include women, despite them being eligible for all combat roles and serving the same way as men. Should this change? Some say it's only fair, and others are telling the military to get their hands off their daughters. But not all the recruits are human either. Number 37. Good boy. There are 2,700 recruits in the U.S. military who don't follow regular rules. They don't sleep in the barracks, they chase birds in their off time, and they might even greet a commanding officer by licking them. And they're not going to be ordered to do any push-ups because they're military working dogs. In a similar way to police dogs, these elite canine soldiers are specialized in detecting narcotics and explosive devices. They can also patrol for enemies and chase off threats. And not just any good boy can do this job. It takes 16 hours of training every month, plus tests every 3 months to become a military working dog. And then there's the surprising heavy-duty soldiers. Number 36. Robo-troops. U.S. military robots have been around since the 1960s, when the U.S. created the Beetle. This massive robot was designed to be used for handling nuclear materials. They never actually saw use, but smaller robots became an essential part of military life. Today, high-tech robots are used for all sorts of missions, including carrying victims to safety and disarming explosives. And flying drones have become an effective way to eliminate targets without putting troops in harm's way. And unlike other soldiers, these robo-troops don't need rest and food, just an occasional recharge. But it takes a lot of energy to keep the military going. Number 35. Gas, gas, gas. Every time you head to the gas pump, it's hard not to cringe. But if you think filling up a gas tank of a car is bad, imagine the cost of trying to keep a tank or a fighter jet refueled. During World War II, it took around a gallon of fuel each day to support a single soldier, but that was with a lot of foot patrol and collective transports. Today, with high-powered vehicles shuttling soldiers and powerful weapons around the battlefield, it takes around 22 gallons of fuel per day just to support one soldier, and those costs are only going up. And all that fuel adds up. Number 34. Fuel follies. Today, the U.S. Army alone burns through about 1 billion gallons of fuel each year, and that's without a major war going on. In a combat situation, those numbers go up massively, and fuel is a limited resource. The Department of Defense is increasingly worried about both fuel costs and the impact to the environment. So they're looking into increasing the use of alternative energy sources. Not only could this be more efficient, but it would protect the U.S. from an oil embargo from enemy nations. But it's been a long time since the U.S. was truly at war. Number 33. What is it good for? When was the last time the U.S. went to war? You might be thinking Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Vietnam. But the actual answer is against Japan and Nazi Germany when they formally declared war on the Axis powers. Since then, every military action the U.S. has been involved in was not accompanied by a formal declaration of war. Some were classified as police actions, others as limited military operations. While most were authorized by Congress, in none of them did Congress vote on a formal declaration of war. But that could change based on something half a world away. Number 32. The NATO factor. Ever since the post-war founding of the North American Treaty Organization, many countries of Europe and North America have been aligned. The most significant part of the treaty is Article 5, which is a mutual defense pact. If one country in the treaty is attacked by a hostile power, it means all the other countries will consider it an attack against them as well. That means that if a small nation like Belgium is attacked, it would have nuclear powers like the United States, Great Britain, and France coming to its defense. No wonder many countries in Eastern Europe want to join the alliance. But what happens if it's NATO versus NATO? Number 31. Family feud. Say a soccer match between Belgium and the Netherlands gets out of control, and the next thing you know, soldiers from both sides are aiming guns at each other. There are actually no official bylaws on how to govern an attack by one NATO member against another, because the treaty is supposed to prevent exactly that. However, most legal experts believe that NATO would be obligated to assist the country that was attacked. Of course, it's common for parties to disagree on who started the war, even if one fired first. So there's a good chance that NATO might wind up splitting down the middle on who to support, with the US having to choose a side. And they would have to be careful to avoid sending in soldiers that they might not want to. Number 30. The youngest soldier. You usually have to be 18 to join the US military, but that didn't stop countless teenagers from signing up with false documents during the World Wars. But no one topped John Lincoln Clem for jumping the gun. The 9-year-old boy wanted to join the Union Army during the Civil War, and after being rejected once, managed to make it in. He was so small that his superiors in the 22nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry even sawed down his musket so he could carry it. He was a sergeant by age 12 and went on to serve in the military for most of his life, retiring as a major general. But in terms of dedication, no one tops this guy. Number 29, the oldest soldier. To find the oldest active duty member the U.S. military ever had, you've got to head over to the Coast Guard. When Anthony Christie was laid to rest in 1862, the 105-year-old man had a unique distinction. He was still on active duty. How's this possible? He served as a lighthouse keeper, a job that generally didn't involve heavy exertion. As long as his eyes were sharp enough to do his job, the Coast Guard had no reason to retire him. So he kept the lighthouse running almost 40 years past retirement age. And with a lot of people in the military, it means that they need a pretty big headquarters. Number 28. Welcome to HQ. The Department of Defense runs the U.S. military and used to run all the branches. And they're all running out of one building, the Pentagon. It's easy to underestimate since it's relatively flat, but the Pentagon is one of the largest office buildings in the world, with 3 times the office space of massive skyscrapers like the Empire State Building. Holding the brains of the U.S. military and many of its highest-ranking officials, it's also heavily fortified. When the Pentagon was targeted by one of the planes on September 11, 2001, it sustained heavy damage, but the damage was much less widespread than it could have been in another Washington building. So wait, what's that one exception? Number 27. Coastal changes. Why doesn't the Coast Guard operate out of the Department of Defense? It was until post-9/11 laws handed it over to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. Due to the Coast Guard's larger domestic responsibilities, it was uncoupled from the other branch's foreign duties. However, a clause was put into the bill so that if the Coast Guard is needed in an active war, the U.S. Navy can take control of all its assets. And no matter how high someone in the military ranks, they always answer to one person. Number 26. The Commander. The Commander-in-Chief is the highest-ranking position in the military, and they have final say over almost all areas of military policy, up to and including deploying nuclear weapons. And they can outrank the highest generals without ever serving a day in the military. All they have to do is win an election, because the President of the United States doubles as the Commander-in-Chief, and they're the only ones who can begin a military engagement or end it, which might get tense when a president who never served is giving the orders. But there's one other rank that's impossible to reach. Number 25. That 5th star. The rank of 5-star general was created in 1944 to represent soldiers given special promotions above the typical 4-star rank. Over the years, only 10 officers were ever granted 5-star status, 4 in the Navy, 5 in the Army, and 1 in the Air Force. However, there won't be any others. When General Omar Bradley, the last surviving 5-star officer, passed away, the military decided to retire the ranks. But there's one person above all of them in rank. Number 24. The General of the Armies. The year was 1976, and the bicentennial was the perfect time to honor those who made America possible. There was one man who did more than any other, George Washington. He'd been dead for 177 years, but the decision was made to promote him to the title of General of the Armies, a position only held once before by World War I legend John J. Pershing. As part of the promotion, Washington was granted permanent seniority over all U.S. generals and admirals, ensuring that the Father of the United States is its highest-ranking official forever. And for decorated veterans, there's usually one end of the road. Number 23. The final honor. Arlington National Cemetery holds the remains of close to 500,000 U.S. veterans from multiple wars, and generals who pass away are frequently given a place of honor there. Only 2 U.S. presidents have been buried at Arlington: John F. Kennedy, who served with distinction in World War II and was seriously injured in combat, and William Howard Taft. Taft never actually served in the military, but by being a Secretary of War and Commander-in-Chief, he was able to get his plot of land. But not everyone buried at Arlington has a traditional tombstone. Number 22. The unknown. War is messy, and it's not always possible to get everyone home for a proper burial, especially today with high-yield bombs. It's possible for remains to be burned too badly to be identified. That's where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier comes in, a memorial to soldiers who have been buried at Arlington but never identified. There are tombs for World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. One was created for Vietnam, but it's currently empty, after DNA evidence allowed the government to identify Lieutenant Joseph Blassie and give him a proper burial in 1998. And those tombs are attended to by a unique unit. Number 21. The 1st Unit. They call them the Old Guard for a reason. They've been on active duty since 1784. But the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment isn't just any unit of soldiers. They're a ceremonial unit serving as escorts to the U.S. Commander-in-Chief. But they also have one other key duty: the regular changing of the guard ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. But while they're primarily a ceremonial unit, they have been deployed in combat, and 4 members of the unit have been awarded the Medal of Honor, most recently in Vietnam. And the military's ranks have always been diverse. Number 20. A unit of immigrants. When the U.S. military saw many of its forces join the Confederates in the Civil War, they were bailed out by an unlikely source: immigrants, along with a large number of free African Americans who wanted to fight the slaveholding South. The Union Army was 1/3 composed of immigrants, and in a quarter of all regiments, the majority of soldiers were not born in the United States. That pattern continues, and today around 5% of U.S. forces are either naturalized immigrants or non-citizens. Now let's get into some truly strange facts. Number 19. Looking cool. You know those smooth Ray-Ban glasses you love to wear? They didn't come from fashion, but from necessity. When Air Force pilots were struggling to keep their vision straight due to the rays of the sun in the cockpit, Army Air Corps Lieutenant General John McCready contacted glass manufacturer Bausch & Lomb to help make glasses with better anti-sun properties. Soon, the first Ray-Bans were available. Pilots were flying without that persistent nausea and headaches, and were looking good while doing it. It's surprising just how many companies work with the military. Number 18. Crack open a cold one. Who doesn't love an ice cold Coca-Cola? A little taste of home that can be a psychological lifesaver for a struggling soldier. And the company wanted to make sure that it was possible in World War II. Company President Robert Woodruff decreed that any World War II soldier around the world should be able to get a bottle of Coke for a nickel. That led to the creation of the Technical Observer position, which oversaw the management of these wartime plants. Not only did they help distribute 5 billion bottles of Coke around the world, but they had an Army officer's salary and rank. This one's just a little awkward. Number 17. A bad symbol. The 45th Infantry was a proud unit that served in multiple U.S. wars and was unique due to it being made up of a majority of Native Americans. That led them to work indigenous iconography into their sleeve insignias, and they were proudly wearing those pins into battle. At least they did until World War II, because one of those traditional native symbols was the swastika, and after Hitler and the Nazis co-opted it, it was quickly dropped and replaced with a thunderbird. In combat, every little detail matters. Number 16. Smooth snap. Velcro is a convenient tool, an easy way to fasten clothes and items without having to stop to tie things. There's just one problem, that annoying ripping sound that alerts anyone in the immediate area, aka the bane of any teenager sneaking out of the house. Of course, in a combat situation, the consequences of waking up the wrong person might be far more dire. That's why the military developed a silent version of Velcro that reduced that annoying sound almost to nothing. Unfortunately for all those sneaky teenagers, it's still top secret. The military is particular about how they're portrayed as well. Number 15. Hollywood military. You know all those times the military swoops in to save the day? Be it a modern war movie or a ridiculous action movie where the army fights off aliens, they all have one thing in common. If a movie wants to portray the military, they usually work with the Department of Defense's entertainment unit. Many producers want to borrow military equipment or film on military bases for accuracy, and in those cases the Department of Defense gets script approval. Of course, they're not too picky. Some of the movies the DoD approved included Batman and Robin and Last Action Hero. But one movie might have had a bigger impact than any other. Number 14. The Top Gun. When Tom Cruise's military adventure Top Gun was released in 1986, Navy recruiters started hanging out around movie theaters. The men who saw the movie suddenly thought being a pilot was the coolest thing in the world, and some even decided that they would like to sign up on the spot. According to official Navy reports, the position of naval aviator saw a 500% jump in applications in the aftermath, and the brass is no doubt excited for the sequel to finally come out. The U.S. military is always prepared, in more ways than one. Number 13. A useful tool. U.S. military members who do air missions are given a parachute pack survival kit in case they get shot down and need to survive on their own. It includes some useful tools like wire, knives, matches, and fire starters, as well as a large non-lubricated condom. No, the military isn't making sure that soldiers are able to practice safe sex while trying to survive in the jungle. Condoms are stretchy, as anyone who's put one over their entire hand knows, so it can double up as a water canteen that holds up to a liter of rainwater if needed. The military even has a department of trash talk? Number 12. Them's fighting words. In Afghanistan, the U.S. faced a challenge of a motivated and ruthless Taliban opposition that knew the terrain far better than them. It was time to call up the Psychological Warfare Department to develop some new tactics, and what they came up with was loudspeakers that goaded enemy fighters into picking fights they couldn't win by calling them names. Apparently, such inventive nicknames like Cowardly Dogs and Lady Men were enough, even if the tactic might have been borrowed from the elementary school playground. And the military takes care of their own. Number 11. Wounded warriors. Many soldiers come back from combat with serious injuries, some missing limbs or other disabilities. And once they complete their rehabilitation, there's a new challenge waiting for them, the Warrior Games. This Olympic-like competition pits representatives from the various branches of the military against each other for bragging rights, with every competitor being a combat wounded veteran. And since the games began in 2010, the Marines have dominated. And there are some truly odd positions in the military. Number 10. Devil's Advocate. When the military debates new policies, it's easy to fall into groupthink. Not only is there a lot of money at stake, but there's always a high-ranking member in the room, and it's easy to defer to him. But if no one's willing to say no, costly mistakes can happen, which is why some graduates at Fort Leavenworth are trained with the art of being skeptical. These red teamers are unafraid to play devil's advocate in heated debates and can save the team from the bane of consensus. And some things are older than you think. Number 9. Down Under. The submarine is one of the military's most useful tools, able to take command of the seas and deliver powerful and clinical strikes from underwater. It saw the most use in the world wars, but actually goes back far earlier than that. The Turtle, an early example of a submersible weapon, was deployed during the Revolutionary War to sink a British ship off New York and failed miserably. But it was an effective test of future weaponry. But for all the US military's efforts, they can leave a big footprint. Number 8. Eviction notice. The island of Diego Garcia, a British possession, had a population of over 1,000 people living happily in the Indian Ocean paradise until the US military came calling. They wanted to build a military base there. They needed total security, and so the entire island's population needed to go. The British government agreed, and soon the entire population was being sent to the island of Mauritius, which took them after a hefty payment. And the US military's experiments even hit the homeland. Number 7. Spray test. In the 1950s and 60s, residents of cities including San Francisco, St. Louis, and areas of Minnesota, South Carolina, and Georgia saw something alarming. Motorized blowers spraying odd, colorful substances all over the city. It looked almost like a chemical attack, and the zinc-cadmium sulfide wasn't a weapon, but it was related. The fluorescent substance was sprayed because the military wanted to see how chemical or biological weapons could spread by the wind, and there's no better way than actually spraying a close substitute. But other places got it far worse. Number 6. In the depths. In the aftermath of World War II, there was an enormous amount of spare hardware to dispose of. Much of it was dangerous and couldn't simply be scrapped, so the government came up with another solution. Just dump it in the ocean. Much of this started after the First World War and continued until 1970. A wide range of military hardware was dumped, such as 64 million pounds of nerve gas and other chemical weapons, plus hundreds of thousands of bombs, rockets, and landmines, and they're still down there. But no one really knows exactly what's lurking where, and sometimes the military just gets it wrong. Number 5. Firing at nothing. The Great Los Angeles Air Raid of 1942 was one of the biggest military operations in the homeland in a long time. It was World War II, and the military was on high alert for an attack on U.S. soil. So when reports came in of an enemy aircraft, the military responded with overwhelming force. They fired 1,400 anti-aircraft weapons and countless rounds at the mystery object until it was brought down and found that it was a lost weather balloon. Hey, better safe than sorry. But sometimes the military gets pretty innovative. Number 4. Game time. When the military needed a new supercomputer in 2010, they came up with many plans, but few of them were cost-effective. The solution that did pass muster? They collected 1,700 PlayStation 3 consoles, removed and combined much of the hardware, and wound up with an amalgam processing core that had all the power and memory they needed, at a fraction of the cost and carbon footprint. And some of their ideas sounded a little like science fiction. Number 3. Mad science. DARPA, or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is where the military's wildest ideas become a reality. One of those ideas? A computer chip that could be implanted directly into the brains of soldiers. This will allow them to connect remotely to computers without a device, which would allow vital intelligence to be put into their minds directly from headquarters. But not all of DARPA's ideas are that out there. Number 2. Master of invention. DARPA has been responsible for some of the military's wildest and longest-lasting inventions, but they've also given the general public a lot. 2 of their biggest contributions? The Internet, which was heavily funded by the US government along with private tech companies, and the GPS systems that help get you where you're going in your car. Both are used by the government today, but most people can't live without them. But this one last fact about the US military might shock you. Number 1. Boom. The US has only used nuclear bombs twice in combat, and they're currently the only country to do so, but they've used many more nuclear bombs than that. To develop their nuclear arsenal, they've conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests over the decades, more than half the number conducted around the world. 800 of those tests have been underground nuclear tests, while 200 have been atmospheric and created a signature mushroom cloud everyone fears. But for now, that's all they are, tests. The war in Ukraine has proven one thing. The United States military would wipe the floor with Russia. No, we're not funded by the CIA, as many have claimed in the comments section. This is simple objective truth. Let's look at why. If you want to evaluate the capabilities of the two militaries, we must first understand the core philosophy of each fighting force. The Russian military has traditionally been a ground power with heavy focus on its army and artillery, with few warm water ports and almost none that would be immediately under threat from NATO forces. Russia and the Soviet Union before it held no illusions that they could become a major maritime power. Back when the US was fielding its first supercarriers, the Soviet Navy wanted to match the capability until they were reminded that to join the fight anywhere outside their immediate shoreline, they'd first have to run a gauntlet of NATO shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. Geography has not been kind to Russia's dreams of being a naval power, which is why it's never been a truly global power at all, period. This means that any future conflict involving Russia and NATO will most likely take place in Eastern Europe. The Russian military is well suited for that task, with the largest armored vehicle fleet in the world, which it has aggressively used to destroy Ukraine's stockpile of anti-tank missiles. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia had an estimated 170 battalion tactical groups, or about 119,000 ground combat troops, making it one of the largest ground forces in the world. It's in artillery where Russia truly shines, though, and it's been the only saving grace its military has been able to call upon. Before the war, Russia had over 10,000 artillery pieces and nearly 4,000 MLRS. Russia's reliance on artillery is not by accident. It knows full well that it cannot compete in the air against NATO powers, and thus has relied on ground-based fire support to ensure it can provide support for engaged infantry and armor. However, as Ukraine has shown, these numbers are impressive on paper, but far less so when the actual equipment is taken into account, as a significant bulk of this equipment is all from the Cold War and has not seen modernization upgrades. Also, a lot of it simply doesn't work anymore due to poor maintenance or storage, or outright theft of critical components. Ultimately, Russia is a ground power meant to fight a war against the West and Europe. However, it's far from a modern professional military. Rampant corruption has hollowed out every single facet of the Russian war machine and made it an ineffective lumbering giant whose only real advantage is sheer mass. That works against a power like Ukraine to a degree, but it would never work against the American military. America basically won the lottery when it came time to spawn on the world map. It's the single most defensible nation on Earth, quite literally immune to invasion from a hostile power thanks to two giant oceans on each coast and a complete domination of its global hemisphere. This defensive advantage came at a significant cost. To project military power, America would need to first move that power thousands of miles east or west. And that's why the United States has always been a naval power since its creation as a state, when it struggled against the vastly superior Royal British Navy during the Revolutionary War with a handful of boats we'll generously call warships. However, by the dawn of the 20th century, the United States Navy was rivaling the Royal Navy in tonnage and expertise, and would surpass it in the interwar years as the most powerful naval force on Earth. This was all at the expense of its army, because when World War I and World War II kicked off, the US Army was a bit of a clown show. Enthusiastic almost to a fault, the British initially feared a total defeat in Africa when the US Army joined the fighting in World War II. However, under the tutelage of the Allied powers and cutting its teeth in combat, the US Army grew in proficiency, while its Marine Corps, a competent force throughout the early 20th century, would do some of the nastiest, dirtiest fighting on the planet against a fanatical enemy. America emerged from World War II with one clear lesson in mind: never again. Determined to be never second to any other power in the world, the US began to nurture what would become one of the most professional fighting forces in Earth's history. And to that end, it became a technological power, putting its considerable intellectual and engineering resources into developing weapons one or more generations ahead of any potential adversary. In the second half of the 20th century, the United States shifted from a naval power to a naval and air power, unmatched in either arena, with a growing emphasis on air power. Engineers like the late great Kelly Johnson ensured that in the skies America had no peers. Modern Russian military doctrine gravitates around the battalion tactical group, a formation of 600 to 800 combat troops made up of 2 to 4 companies of infantry, usually mechanized, and reinforced with air defense, artillery, engineering, and logistical support units. A tank and a rocket artillery company are typically attached to each BTG. The BTG is meant to operate as a combined arms maneuver unit and has the advantage of allowing for the use of support assets such as artillery at the tactical level. A relative lack of infantry, though, with only about 200 infantrymen per BTG, means that it's difficult for this formation to actually hold territory, and the Russian army relies heavily on Marines, paratroopers, or other units for the task. The fact that Russia is already looking to reorganize its BTGs is indicative of how well they perform against a near-peer adversary. Lessons learned in Ukraine are showing that the BTG is a more lumbering beast than agile, tactical, combined arms maneuvering unit. Though in truth, this probably has more to do with the quality of Russian soldiers, doctrine, and leadership than the composition of the BTG. One significant weakness of the Russian military is its ability to coordinate effectively. This has made the BTG a fundamentally flawed composition, as it decentralizes Russia's greatest asset, its artillery. Unable to coordinate its massive advantage in artillery, as big as 20 to 1 during the first 6 to 8 months of the war in Ukraine, and 8 to 1 on average today,
Russia has had far less success in leveraging its only real overmatch against the far smaller and less equipped Ukrainian military. British intelligence indicated that as of November 2022, Russia was already starting to move away from the BTG concept. The U.S. Army's Brigade Combat Team is everything the battalion tactical group tried to be, and more. A BCT can come in 4 flavors: infantry, striker, armored, and strawberry lemonade. BCTs are meant to be fully self-supporting units and deployable anywhere in the world for any mission that the U.S. Army requires of them. As such, they have various assets native to them. The infantry BCT is made up of about 4,500 soldiers and is organized around a core of 3 battalions of infantry. This already makes them significantly more powerful than Russia's BTG, as each battalion is made up of around 1,000 soldiers. However, this also means that the U.S. fields far fewer BCTs than Russia fields BTGs, with only 14 active BCTs in the U.S. Army. American infantry is either mechanized or motorized, deployed in Bradley infantry fighting vehicles or using HMMWVs or their equivalent replacement, giving the BCT an emphasis on high mobility. Alongside its infantry, a BCT will typically contain 1 recon cavalry battalion, 1 brigade support battalion, 1 engineer battalion, and 1 field artillery battalion. A striker BCT is centered around the use of the striker armored vehicle and is meant to plug a gap between the U.S. Army's light infantry and heavy armored infantry. It's also meant to be a very fast response unit, with an entire brigade being airlifted anywhere in the world within 96 hours and a division within 120 hours. Like the infantry BCT, a striker BCT is made up of 3 infantry battalions in 300 striker vehicles, 1 recon cavalry battalion, 1 artillery battalion, 1 brigade support battalion, 1 brigade headquarters and headquarters company, and 1 brigade engineer battalion. An anti-tank company made up of the mobile gun system variant of the Striker directly supports the Striker BCT against enemy armor. The Armored Brigade Combat Team is what the U.S. military sends when you've fudged around and it's time for you to find out. This is the armored fist of the American military, specifically designed to break the strongest of enemy defenses. The core of this formation is its 87 Abrams main battle tanks and 152 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And an armored BCT can come in 2 varieties, with either 2 tank companies and 1 mechanized infantry company, or 2 mechanized infantry companies and 1 tank company. As the U.S. shifts away from its fighting insurgencies and the war on terror back to fighting near-peer adversaries, so too is its BCTs changing. The Waypoint 2028 program, later rebranded to Army 2030, is looking to fundamentally redesign how America deploys its battalion combat teams, with a focus on armor to face near-peer threats. This redesign aims to move artillery from the BCT to the divisional level, much the same as Russia is attempting to do, so that it can be better employed across a wide engagement front while also improving survivability in a heavily contested electronic warfare environment where communications may not always be guaranteed between units. Engineering units are also being reorganized to a divisional level for much the same reason. As has famously been said, war doesn't tolerate BS, and the American Battalion Combat Team has been put to the fire multiple times. Each time, its superior mobility and coordination proved decisive, while Russia's smaller battalion tactical groups, ironically smaller and meant to be more maneuverable, have not been. This is largely due to training, leadership, and doctrine, though. The biggest flaw with the Russian military is a lack of professional training and soldiers both. With a culture of abuse and corruption, the Russian armed forces have a difficult time retaining recruits, and only an estimated 2% of conscripts chose to sign an enlistment contract at the end of their mandatory service. This extremely high turnover rate means that the Russian military lacks seasoned troops, which form the backbone of any modern military, and directly leads to a crippling lack of non-commissioned officers. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia attempted to fix this by creating new training programs for NCOs and offering incentives for soldiers to re-enlist. As the war has shown, this has not been enough. Regular Russian officers have been forced to pick up the duties an NCO would, and senior officers have even been spotted leading platoon-sized actions. Inevitably, these senior officers get killed or wounded, further eroding the discipline and capabilities of the Russian military. If all the managers at a restaurant disappeared because they'd been killed, it'd be very difficult for a bunch of cashiers, cooks, and waitstaff to do the specialized tasks senior management is responsible for, such as ordering, handling pay and benefits, scheduling, etc. In effect, this is what's happening with the Russian military today. Its brain drain slowly attrits the forces, and every day the Russian military is in effect getting dumber, and that's really saying something. The United States, like every other modern nation, is having difficulty reaching recruitment quotas and retaining those already in service. Ironically, the US believed it would have difficulty recruiting during the lengthy wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it wasn't until the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan that a true recruitment crisis occurred. Today, the US Army is short 25% of its needed recruits, with estimates putting the US Army down 7% of its current force numbers in 2 years. Other services aren't suffering as badly, but still face their own challenges, with only the US Marines coming out relatively okay thanks to strong retention rates. The US military is struggling to remain competitive versus a strong economy, and the lack of conflict ironically means that potential recruits don't see service as a critical nation need, and nothing could be further from the truth given the potential threat of conflict with China. COVID, however, has had a significant effect on the recruitment crisis, with an explosion of mental and physical health issues amongst the younger Americans who would normally fill out the military's ranks. Also, adherence to physical and mental standards disqualifies a large group of individuals from even considering service in the first place. And while the US could do like China and lower recruitment standards over half a dozen times, doing so would only result in subpar troops. Recruitment crisis and its implications for an all-volunteer force aside, the US military is worlds away from the Russian military in professionalism and education. Hazing exists, as it does in any major organization, but in the Russian army, this is actively encouraged rather than punished. Likewise, US troopers aren't stripping the wiring out of their vehicles to sell at a local market. A strong NCO corps ensures discipline and training standards are met, as well as an institutional system of oversight and accountability. Whereas in the Russian military, training is typically done only long enough for someone to snap a picture of it and send it up the chain as proof. There are multiple levels of accountability for US personnel, and unlike a heavily conscripted force, American servicemen generally want to increase their training and education. Education is something the US military takes very seriously, heavily encouraging personnel at all levels to pursue higher education by making it free. For senior personnel, the US also operates 5 world-class war colleges, which instruct American officers alongside officers from nations all over the world. For America, war is both a science and an art form. But the real difference between the two militaries is their very fundamental nature. The US military encourages, even instills in its personnel a sense of initiative. The Russian army does not. Russia continues to fight like its Soviet predecessor, with a heavy top-down command structure that discourages personal initiative. The US military, by comparison, encourages leadership at every level, from an individual squad leader to a senior general, to act on their own initiative after exercising good judgment. This makes the US a military of many potential leaders, insulating it from the combat attrition of command personnel. Meanwhile, we have plenty of evidence from Ukraine of entire Russian units paralyzed because of severed links to command staff. This glaring vulnerability of the Russian military is what originally prompted the US to develop the most lethal war doctrine to date, air-land battle, now evolved to sea-air-land battle. This operational doctrine is the core philosophy of how the US fights wars, and it was revealed to the world for the first time in the early 1990s during Operation Desert Storm. It's so frighteningly effective that it took even US military planners completely by surprise, sweeping aside one of the world's largest armies with absolute ease. Sea-air-land battle seeks to present an adversary with conundrums across the full warfighting spectrum to sow chaos and uncertainty amongst the enemy, opening up vulnerabilities and opportunities in one or more domains. To achieve this, the US has become a truly combined arms force, with ground, air, space, and naval assets tightly coordinated together via tactical data links, something Russia is still struggling with to this day. While Russia has coordinated its aerospace forces with ground-based air defenses, it's struggled to loop in its ground combat units to achieve what the US had long ago mastered: common engagement capability. This is the ability for one spotter to observe an enemy and guide another shooter's weapons to the target, and it's the secret behind the US's lethality. Unlike Soviet forces, which sought decisive battles with overwhelming force, the US specializes in launching deep strikes into enemies' rear areas, specifically targeting logistics and command and control, or C2 nodes. This is why the US has placed a heavy emphasis on its air forces, stealth, and standoff attack capability, as well as extreme precision rocket artillery, soon to be supplemented with ground-based ballistic missiles with extremely long ranges. While the Air Force is busy making a mess of the enemy's communications and supplies, ground forces strike at the enemy in smaller, more mobile formations that attack from a variety of different directions. This makes it difficult for the enemy to coordinate a defense especially when their command and control has been disrupted or destroyed. A focus on rapid mobility and communications allows the U.S. to quickly identify breaches in enemy formations and rapidly exploit them with overwhelming force. The U.S. has basically adopted Muhammad Ali's famous adage of floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee, and it's proven its mettle against numerically superior forces time and again. Now let's look at the specifics of what actually makes the U.S. a superior force over the Russian military. Let's start with the basics. Communications. Communications is key to battlefield success. Without it, you can't tell your troops what to do and when to do it. Of all the investments in technology that the U.S. has made, few surpass the untold billions that went into building the most robust, secure battlefield networks in the world, and they are the key to the U.S.'s success. Thanks to tactical data links, the Link 16 and future replacement Link 22, American units can freely swap information between each other. Even weapons en route to their target can speak to another, such as the new long-range anti-ship missile, which can deconflict when launched in volleys to ensure all missiles don't hit the same target, and can update target priorities as missiles in a volley are knocked out by enemy air defenses. But at the very basic level, secure communications allows the U.S. to move units around and coordinate without letting the enemy be privy to this information. Russia does not have this capability. Immediately after the invasion began, frontline reports from Ukrainian troops revealed that communications amongst Russian military was very poor, with units often relying on unencrypted civilian radios or even cell phones. Russian strategic bombers, the very same craft responsible for delivering a retaliatory nuclear strike, were also recorded using unsecured communications. On paper, Russia is supposed to have secure, encrypted communications for all or at least most of its units. Russian soldiers have been observed using advanced radios such as the R-187P1 AZART and the R-162-5UN2, both of which were discovered on a captured Russian paratrooper after the failed Antonov airport attack. However, the fighting in Ukraine has shown that this is simply not the case, and one need only look at Russia's history of corruption to understand why. In 2021, senior military figures and the manufacturer of the AZART radio came under investigation for embezzlement, with millions of rubles meant to purchase encrypted radios for the military vanishing into the pockets of various officials instead. To make matters worse, as Ukraine gets better at pinpointing Russian communication, officers are moving further and further away from the front, to the point that Russian units have reported having to resort to cell phones to reach them and ask for orders. The general failure of the Russian officer corps aside, which cowardly moves to the rear as they send their own men to their death, going up against a technologically advanced foe such as the United States with unsecure communications, is its own death sentence. The U.S. has made communications a top priority, issuing the ANPRC-148 to its combat units. In fact, communications are so important that units in the field will typically deploy with multiple backups, including radios for local traffic and long-range radios and satellite radios for emergencies. Embedded personnel such as Air Force combat controllers will have their own radios to communicate with overhead aircraft, waiting to bring the boom when asked. And they can even stream video directly from overhead assets to get a bird's eye view of the battlefield, taking advantage of superior sensors on U.S. aircraft. If there is one flaw with U.S. communications, it's that there are too many different radios, and efforts to consolidate them into a single system have so far failed. That hasn't stopped the U.S. from throwing millions at the problem until eventually, hopefully, it goes away, something that it's exceptionally good at to a fault. The next significant difference between the two militaries' infantry is their equipment. Take a look at these two photos and see if you can spot the differences. Anyone who served in the ground combat role can probably spot them immediately, but don't feel bad if you can't. The differences are subtle, but make all the difference in the world, and makes U.S. soldiers far superior to their Russian counterparts. Need a clue? Look at the helmets, specifically the front of the helmets. You might notice that Russian helmets have no mounts for night vision. Now look at the rifles and compare the rifles of the American soldiers with those of the Russian soldiers. Spot a difference? Most Russian rifles come with no optics whatsoever, while American combat rifles already have optics when given to the troops. Even more importantly, American rifles carry the PAC family of laser systems, which are critical for aiming with night vision. Russian rifles do not carry these. So even on the rare occasion that a Russian soldier might have night vision, which is estimated at 1 in 10 soldiers, they're unable to use their rifles while also using their night vision. By comparison, every single U.S. soldier is issued night vision and the required laser targeting system with which to use it properly. Other key differences include the mass adoption of armored vests by the US military. While most troops who are lucky enough to be issued body armor in the Russian military are typically issued what are colloquially known as second-chance vests, poorly suited for stopping high-powered rifle rounds. US soldiers also carry supplemental equipment such as radios, gloves, knee pads, and eye protection. Russian soldiers largely lack these small bits of kit that can end up giving an edge to a warfighter. And we're not cherry-picking here. You're welcome to look up photos of US soldiers in action versus their Russian counterparts. While there are elite Russian units who have access to what is standard US infantry, the entire point is that this is standard for all US infantry. The US owns the night and prefers to run night combat operations to exercise its vast advantage in imaging over any potential adversary. But more importantly, the US invests heavily in making sure its troops have the right equipment for the job, and this extends to its combat vehicles. American optics are on the whole superior to their Russian counterparts, especially as sanctions kick in and Russia's denied Western optics or the components to build its own. New Russian tanks are being sent to the front with nothing more than gunner sights, significantly lessening their effectiveness against Western tanks being donated to Ukraine. By the way, Russia had invested heavily into developing a native capability to build advanced night vision devices. However, the entire affair collapsed in on itself when corruption inevitably took a massive bite out of the budget, and the officials overseeing the company set up to produce domestic night vision kit were discovered to be siphoning off funds for themselves instead. Now, when Russia needs it the most, it's unable to produce the specialized components required for night vision optics. The entire Russian military suffers from a lack of kit that would be considered standard in the US military. Russian aviation, for example, has only a few aircraft capable of providing accurate air support for ground units, as the bulk of its air fleet lacks the targeting pods necessary for the task. The US, by comparison, has hundreds of these aircraft and can basically bolt on a targeting pod to just about anything that you can think of hurling into the sky. An Abrams tank might not be very aerodynamic, but if it wanted to, the US could strap a targeting pod and a rocket onto it, and for its brief flight through the sky be capable of delivering accurate ground fire for friendly forces. Russia's inability to do the same was on full display during the famed Belgorod incursion by the Free Russia Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps, when a Russian Su-34 dropped dumb gravity bombs that missed their target by a generous few hundred meters or so. The differences between the Russian and American military are so significant that we could probably do an entire 60-minute episode on the topic. Matter of fact, if this video gets enough views, we'll do a part 2, and present even more evidence from Ukraine on how the United States would absolutely decimate the Russian military. And for anyone who still doubts this or thinks we're just shilling for the US, remember that in June of 2022, the US sent a dozen HIMARS batteries to Ukraine, and it absolutely wrecked Russia's day. If Russia has yet to eliminate a single of the now 30 or so estimated HIMARS in Ukraine, how exactly does it expect to cope with the 400 still in the US inventory?
It's the world's most technologically advanced military. It's also home to equipment almost 100 years old. These are some of the oldest weapons still in operation in the US military. M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. It's been the United States' premier heavy machine gun for a whopping 89 years, and it's not looking to retire anytime soon. Designed in 1918 and adopted by the US military in 1933, the M2 packs a formidable 50 caliber bullet, fired at a muzzle velocity of 890 meters per second. It has a maximum range of 7,400 meters and an effective range of 1,800 meters. This machine gun is powerful enough to punch through even some armored vehicles, and that's exactly what it was originally meant to do. At the end of World War I, more heavily armored planes were being put into the air, with the German Junkers JI sporting an armor that made traditional aircraft machine guns largely ineffective. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, requested the Army Ordnance Department develop a heavier machine gun capable of punching through improved aircraft armor. His request was for a machine gun capable of firing a minimum 50 caliber round at a minimum muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second. John M. Browning began redesigning his 30-06 M1917 machine gun to be capable of firing a heavier round requested by General Pershing. On October 15, 1918, Browning's first prototype was tested, though it achieved a less than stellar performance with a firing rate of less than 500 rounds a minute and a muzzle velocity of only 700 meters per second. To make matters worse, the weapon was very heavy, heavy compared to lower caliber models, was difficult to control when firing fully automatic, and was too weak to punch through armor while firing too slowly to be effective against enemy infantry. Browning got unexpected aid when a shipment of German T-Gewehr 1918 anti-tank rifles and their ammunition were seized by American forces. The German rounds had an 800-grain bullet with a muzzle velocity of 820 meters a second and could penetrate 1 inch of armor at 230 meters. Using the German rounds as inspiration, Winchester worked on improving the .50 caliber's cartridge, eventually leading to an effective round that achieved most of what the Army had requested of it. From 1921 to 1937, American aircraft were equipped with an experimental water-cooled version of the machine gun. These trials helped to refine the various versions of what would become the M2, formally adopted by the United States before World War II. By the time the war broke out, the machine gun was standard on nearly every American aircraft and was used in everything from anti-materiel to infantry support and even air defense roles. Today, the .50 caliber enjoys service alongside American troops in every theater of operations and has been involved in every American conflict since World War II. Modern .50 calibers can be equipped with several different types of ammunition, including M33 ball rounds for personal and light material targets, M17 tracer, M8 armor-penetrating incendiary, M20 armor-penetrating incendiary tracers, and newer saboted light armor penetrator rounds capable of punching through 1.34 inches of steel armor at 500 meters. The M2, nicknamed the 50 or Mod Deuce, is such a good weapon it outperformed an intended replacement in the 60s, and a current modern replacement for the weapon was canceled. This means the US military will continue carrying the fearsome M2 into battle for decades more to come. Our next weapon system is not as old as the M2, but current plans are to keep it in operation for almost an entire century. CH-47 Chinook. It was a helicopter born of necessity. Caught up in a war waged across inhospitable jungles with few roads, the U.S. Army desperately needed a way to quickly supply fire bases spread across Vietnam. Most importantly, though, it needed to be able to supply those far-flung fire bases with heavy equipment such as artillery. But cutting a road through the thick jungle would take years, and even then, the unpredictable weather and enemy ambushes could make such a journey impossible. The United States invented air assault operations during Vietnam with its extensive fleet of helicopters, and quickly sought to do the same with logistical concerns. However, current helicopters in the U.S. inventory were simply not powerful enough to carry heavy howitzers. Fortuitously, though, a twin-rotor transport helicopter had already been in development since 1957 to replace the Sikorsky CH-37 Mojave. The resulting V-107 was deemed too heavy for assault operations but too light for transport missions. Thus, work was undertaken to develop a larger, beefier helicopter capable of heavy transport duty. In 1962, the CH-47 Chinook officially joined the inventory of the U.S. Armed Forces. Despite its massive size, the Chinook has an impressive speed of 200 miles per hour, and at the time was faster than any other utility or even attack helicopter. Today, the Chinook keeps that speed record, making it one of the fastest helicopters in the U.S. inventory. Throughout its lifetime, the airframe has received numerous upgrades to keep it up to date with new technology, but the core design remains largely unchanged. With two powerful rotors, the Chinook can carry up to 55 fully equipped combat troops or as much as 10 tons of cargo either inside or slung underneath it on cargo hooks. The helicopter would prove its worth through every U.S. conflict since Vietnam, but really shown during the war in Afghanistan. With its difficult and mountainous terrain, Afghanistan proved to be a challenge for the U.S. Army carrying out resupply and mobility operations, but the Chinook was easily able to navigate even the extreme heights of Afghanistan's mountains with ease. The Chinook continues going strong 60 years after being adopted into the U.S. inventory. The Army's future vertical lift program will eventually deliver a replacement for the Chinook, but will focus first on a replacement for the UH-60 Blackhawk. In the meantime, future upgrades will keep the Chinook in operation for a predicted 99 years. Our next weapon is not just old, but proved to be so good at its job that its use was even expanded within the U.S. military. Carl Gustaf Recoilless Rifle. In service since 1946, the Carl Gustaf 8.4cm recoilless rifle is perhaps the most successful anti-tank weapon ever made, and the U.S. military plans on continuing to use it for a long time. The Carl Gustaf M1 was developed in 1946 by Hugo Abramson and Harold Jeans at the Royal Swedish Arms Administration. The weapon was developed with the help of knowledge gained from the operation of American bazookas, British Piats, and German Panzerschreck during the war, building on the strengths of each while making its own innovations. The greatest of these innovations was the use of a rifle barrel to spin stabilize an explosive round, negating the need for a projectile to be outfitted with fins and thus reducing weight and improving performance. Another improvement over the Allied and German World War II anti-tank weapons came in the form of developing the weapon as a recoilless system. A recoilless weapon ejects countermass from the rear of the weapon to negate the effect of recoil when firing. This allows the weapon to be much more accurate and to fire a larger projectile, while making the firing unit lighter and easier to use. Today, the Carl Gustaf is an extremely economical solution for the anti-tank and anti-material needs of any infantry unit, with a unit cost of just $20,000 and an ammo cost that ranges from $500 to $3,000 depending on the round. The weapon can fire up to 6 rounds a minute with a crew of 2, though it can be operated by just 1 soldier at a reduced rate of fire. It's also capable of accurately hitting moving vehicles at a range of up to 400 meters, stationary targets up to 500 meters, and can use high explosive rounds with a range of 1,000 meters, or rocket-boosted laser-guided ammunition at a range of up to a whopping 2,000 meters. The U.S. military initially only issued the weapon to Special Operations Forces, but it was so good at its job, it expanded the use of the Carl Gustaf to regular forces as well. With the U.S. forces being engaged by RPGs at ranges up to 900 meters, no light weapon in the inventory of U.S. infantry could effectively counter this threat. Thus, the M3 multi-role anti-armor anti-tank weapon system variant of the Carl Gustaf quickly came into wide adoption. Along with wider adoption came an increased variety in ammunition, which quickly made the M3 a favorite of U.S. infantry. Today, the Carl Gustaf can fire high-explosive rounds, high-explosive anti-tank rounds, high-explosive anti-tank rocket-assisted rounds for increased range, high-explosive dual-purpose rounds for engaging enemy vehicles and structures, area defense rounds for engaging large numbers of enemy troops, anti-structure rounds for destroying enemy buildings, smoke rounds for creating a thick smoke screen, and illumination rounds for lighting up large swaths of grounds at night. The Carl Gustaf is so good at its job there is no planned replacement in the pipeline, and instead it continues to be upgraded with even more modern projectiles and electronics. Our next aircraft has been the workhorse of the American Air Force for 65 years and looks to continue that role for another 30. The C-130 Hercules. During the Cold War, the United States knew it could be forced to fight in the most destructive conflict mankind could ever wage. Given the unprecedented destruction of even a non-nuclear conflict between itself and the Soviet Union, the U.S. needed to ensure it could still resupply forces across a devastated Europe. To that end, it called upon the C-130 Hercules, possibly the world's most rugged and versatile cargo aircraft. Its primary selling point was its ability to operate out of makeshift airfields, a key concern for a U.S. military facing a very real probability of having Allied airfields knocked out of commission by Soviet forces. Its requirements, however, were set in the years after the Korean War, when the U.S. realized it needed dedicated military cargo aircraft and not models adapted from civilian use. The C-130 would be specifically designed to be a modern military cargo plane with a capacity of 92 passengers or 72 combat troops. Alternatively, it could fit 64 paratroopers and all of the equipment they need instead. The use of 4 turboprop engines gave the aircraft greater range and gas mileage than a turbojet variant, and explains why it remains in use throughout the modern age. With few core design changes, the C-130 remains in service with various configurations, including the vaunted AC-130 gunship, the modern C-130J Super Hercules, featuring improved avionics, new engines, new composite propellers, and other modern updates, ski-equipped variants for ice operations, and the tactical airlift and aerial refueling variant in use by the U.S. Marine Corps. Maritime patrol versions are in service with the U.S. Coast Guard, and a ruggedized version of the Hercules is used in the deployment and retrieval of Special Operations Forces. The C-130 remains in service not just in the U.S. military, but in militaries around the world, and looks set to continue serving with its home nation until the U.S. Air Force completes its CX Next Generation Airlifter program. Our next entry in this list is not just one of the oldest serving weapons in the U.S. inventory, but is scheduled to have a lifetime in excess of 100 years. The B-52 Stratofortress Strategic Bomber. It can level a small town all on its own, and it can fly a whopping 1/3 of the way around the Earth without refueling to do so. It's the United States' big stick, the B-52 Stratofortress. Its origins herald back to 1945, just 2 months after the end of World War II. The United States was already looking ahead to the next conflict. The Air Materiel Command put out requests to aircraft manufacturers for what would become the heavy bomber of the future. This aircraft would need to carry out missions far from home and operate without the aid of advanced bases in other countries. In other words, this big bomber needed to have a great enough range that it could strike anywhere in the world without worrying about securing ground bases in other countries to do so. It was to have a crew of at least 5 turret gunners to defend the aircraft and a 6-man relief crew for long-range and long-duration missions. The aircraft would need to cruise at a minimum of 300 miles per hour at a height of 43,000 feet and be capable of hitting targets 5,000 miles away. For defense, it would carry 20mm cannons, and on the offense, it would drop 10,000 pounds high explosives. For the next several years, Boeing and the U.S. military would go back and forth on design changes, finally landing on the B-52 we recognize today in 1952. The aircraft would go on to break break many records, shockingly even speed records, setting a world speed record of 560.705 miles per hour in 1958, only to be broken that same day by another B-52 flying at 597.675 miles per hour. That speedy bomber would eventually be outrun by a smaller jet aircraft, but the big plane continued to set and break records in endurance with a whopping 12,532-mile unrefueled flight in 1962. With the support of aerial tankers, though, B-52s were able to circle the globe non-stop in just under 2 days. This incredible reach and endurance quickly earned the planes a nuclear mission, and to this day it remains part of the U.S. nuclear triad. However, it's the conventional firepower that makes the B-52s the undisputed kings of the sky. With the ability to drop a whopping 70,000 pounds of explosives on any target around the world, modern upgrades to the fleet include new engines and wing structure replacements, electro-optical sensors, and infrared and advanced targeting pods. B-52s are now capable of such precise strikes that they were used commonly as close air support platforms for coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, delivering overwhelming firepower with pinpoint accuracy. Originally meant to saturate a target with dumb gravity bombs, modern B-52s use a suite of onboard sensors to monitor a battlefield and deliver precision fire exactly where it's needed most. Laser-guided bombs can be guided to a target by a B-52 or allied aircraft, or even by forces on the ground. GPS-guided munitions can be fired and forgotten by a loitering B-52, and the development of long-range standoff attack munitions can give the B-52 an incredible reach even in contested air environments by staying well out of the reach of enemy weapons and sensors. With even more upgrades to come, the American B-52 fleet is set to remain in operation for an estimated additional 50 years, with some estimates placing the B-52 total lifetime at 150 years. That means that by the year 2100, B-52s could still be flying as part of America's arsenal.
The Ukraine War is the biggest conflict Europe has seen since World War II, and it's the first to feature some of the newest weapons of the 21st century. But it's also made the United States military realize that it might not be up to the task of fighting a modern conventional conflict. Lessons learned from Ukraine are changing everything, from the way America fights to even redesigning some of its most well-known combat systems. The Ukraine war will soon have been raging for 2 years, as Russia continues to throw itself against the brick wall that is Ukraine. The once mighty former superpower, feared by the world, and widely considered the second most powerful army on Earth, is a shadow of its former self, and has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia is far more bark than bite. But that doesn't mean that this has been an easy war, and lessons learned here indicate that nobody, including the US military, is prepared for a conflict of this scale. The first lesson the US learned is how voraciously modern war consumes stocks of weapons and ammunition. Both Russia and Ukraine are expending thousands of shells a day, going through nearly a full year's worth of production in just 1 month of fighting. The war between Russia and Ukraine has become a numbers game for Russia. Long believed to be a capable modern military power, Russia is instead forced to resort to brute force to attempt to break Ukraine's military. Meanwhile, Ukraine is in a race against time, employing superior Western weapons and a whole lot of determination to dismantle the Russian military before it can in turn bleed Ukraine dry. The race for supplies is in full swing for both sides, and it turns out that neither side is prepared for the demands of a modern conventional war. Russia, which began with a 20-to-1 artillery advantage, is now only conducting between 5 and 6 times more shelling missions than Ukraine. For its part, Ukraine's firing about 6,000 rounds a day, but it says it needs 10,000 rounds to break Russian lines. At its peak, Russia was firing a whopping 60,000 rounds a day and still didn't manage to break Ukrainian lines. German defense manufacturer Rheinmetall has estimated that Ukraine needs 1.5 million rounds every year. Nobody knows how many artillery shells the US has stockpiled away. That information is kept confidential in order to undermine enemy efforts. But we do know that the US has supplied over 2 million shells to Ukraine throughout the conflict. However, last year, the US was only producing about 16,000 shells a month, and Europe wasn't doing much better. New legislation in both Europe and the US aims to dramatically increase production capabilities, but those are going to take time. The US is aiming to make as many as 24,000 shells by the end of 2023 and 100,000 shells a month by 2025. Combined with current European production of 300,000 shells a year at the start of 2023, the Allies are a long way off meeting Ukraine's needs. And when looking at these figures, one has to keep in mind that not all of these shells can simply be shipped off to Ukraine. Each nation has its own needs for shells to use in combat operations, training, or simply stockpiling away for the next time Russia decides to do something stupid. And every Western nation is now expanding its reserve stocks in anticipation of another major conventional war. Meaning, in the best-case scenario, Ukraine could probably receive about half of what's produced every year.
This puts Ukraine in a rather precarious position as the war grinds on, which is why the West has also been expanding access to alternative munitions, like cluster shells. These controversial munitions are especially effective against infantry in trenches, but widely denounced for their habit of leaving large amounts of unexploded ordnance behind that can pose a significant risk to friendly troops and civilians years after a conflict concludes. It should be noted, though, that Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of the fighting, including even against civilian targets. We shouldn't allow ourselves to sink to Russia's level by any means, but one must remain sober and clear-eyed about Russia's historical willingness to resort to every imaginable depravity because they already have in just a year and a half of fighting. Whatever the official figure, the US clearly does not believe it has sufficient ammunition stockpiles, but even more importantly, it doesn't have the capability to produce more ammunition. Having deep reserves is nice, but artillery shells can age out after about 30 years. Even more importantly, a nation needs the ability to rapidly ramp up production of warfighting goods, and shells are amongst the most important goods. This is a critical deficiency that the US has been dealing with since the end of the Cold War, when the vast network of defense contractors were either driven out of business or consolidated into a handful of companies. Defense plants across the nation were shuttered, and very few of these were kept in any state of readiness to be reopened again in case of an emergency. On one hand, it makes sense. A military would rather have money for active capabilities like new tanks, airplanes, and equipment than for reserve capabilities like keeping arms manufacturers open and its employees paid without actually providing anything. But the war in Ukraine has shown that defense investments cannot be just for active inventory. Modern war is absolutely brutal and consumes resources at a truly apocalyptic rate. Going forward, defense investments must include investing into the ability to quickly ramp up manufacturing at a large scale. Currently, the US arms industry is basically a boutique shop that makes everything to order. Lockheed Martin only makes 156 F-35s a year, and only a part of those are for America's military, the rest are for its partners. Now, when specifically talking about artillery shells, the US future needs come with a very specific caveat. The fighting in Ukraine is not truly an accurate representation of what a major conventional war with direct US involvement would look like. The Ukrainian war very quickly turned from combined arms maneuver war to something more closely resembling the vast trench networks of World War I. This is due to Ukraine's inexperience and lack of capabilities to conduct combined arms operations. And while Russia has access to all the right equipment for it, its military is a clown factory. The US military, to put it bluntly, is incredibly lethal. This is not an accident. The US has invested significant resources into learning from its past mistakes and developing the best war colleges in the world. Official US doctrine is to present an adversary with multiple domain challenges simultaneously in order to stress and break their ability to respond adequately to all or any of them. And it's very well equipped, and most importantly trained, to do just that. US aviators regularly train to coordinate with ground forces, while planners exercise at deconflicting airspace for US ground-based air defenses, so Russia can continue winning the gold medal at shooting down its own aircraft. The emphasis is on maneuver warfare in order to keep the enemy off guard and avoid the strategic quagmires of the past. And just about every weapon in the US arsenal is designed for these combined arms operations. A war between the US and Russia would not devolve into trench-to-trench fighting simply because American all-domain capabilities are significantly more advanced than Russia's. This means that there's a very low likelihood of a war devolving into the quagmire that Ukraine's Eastern Front finds itself in. But that chance isn't zero. As a French parliamentary member recently said, "We believed we could do everything with airplanes," when referencing the West's lack of artillery shells. The US doesn't like losing conventional wars, but it really doesn't mind taking runner-up in unconventional ones, apparently. This means that while the chance of war devolving to an artillery duel is extremely low, the US wishes to be prepared. And to do that, it needs to dramatically increase both its reserve of shells and its capability to create new ones. But it's not just shells, because this war has been eating up other weapons at a prodigious rate as well. America has sent around 5,000 javelins to Ukraine since fighting began, and it's unknown how many Javelin anti-tank missiles it has left in its own stockpiles. But like artillery shells, America's looking to ramp up production here as well. About 50,000 Javelins are in service with the US and its allies and partners, which means in just a year and a half, 10% of the stockpile has been sent to an active war zone. In 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US expended 5,000 Javelins. So 1 year of conventional war has expended as many Javelins as the US needed in 20 years. Another lesson the US has learned from the war in Ukraine is that the next major war America fights may not be as permissive an environment to its high-tech weapons as it would like. When Russia launched its initial invasion of Ukraine, it waged a largely unreported but extremely effective electronic war against its victim. Russian electronic warfare platforms completely overwhelmed Ukraine's ability to coordinate and communicate. But they worked a little too well and, in typical Russian fashion, affected Russia's own abilities to the point it had to significantly curtail the use of electronic warfare. The initial expertise in EW was quickly diminished, though, as Ukraine regained its balance and Russia didn't have the upper hand anymore. What would follow is a conflict where Russia's significant EW capabilities were poorly used, though that doesn't mean that they haven't still had a significant effect. One of the first major aid packages from the US to Ukraine was thousands of secure radios to avoid the worst effects of Russian electronic warfare and help better coordinate the troops on the ground. The introduction of HIMARS was revolutionary, single-handedly making the famous fall counteroffensive of 2022 a stunning success. HIMARS uses GPS-assisted precision munitions, but as the war wore on, its effectiveness has been increasingly limited. Today, Russia is interfering with a large number of HIMARS strikes against its most sensitive targets, though it seems relatively unable to protect frontline troops from its devastating precision effects. Around May of this year, it became clear that Russia was doing a decent job of interfering with HIMARS strikes. By jamming the GPS signal the rocket uses, its precision was significantly reduced. This in turn prompted the US to rush to develop new software aimed at circumventing Russian jamming, and Ukraine and the US made striking at Russian Zytel R330ZH jamming stations a top priority. These mobile jamming units, however, can be difficult to identify and quickly eliminate, though a leak from the Pentagon showed that US officials were strongly pushing for Russian jamming units to become priority targets over pretty much anything else. Ukraine promptly deployed special forces behind enemy lines with the sole purpose of hunting these down and destroying them. The jammers weren't just causing issues for HIMARS batteries, but for other Western-supplied precision weapons like JDAMs and precision artillery shells. The developments in Ukraine have showed how vulnerable American smart weapons can be in a near-peer conflict, and prompted both the US and Britain to work together to develop new ways of protecting their systems from jamming or eliminating adversary jamming systems. 40 years ago, early GPS units were credited with the coalition's stunning success on the ground against Iraqi forces. It wasn't just the might of Western tanks and close air support, it was the ability to navigate with extreme degrees of precision across a featureless desert. The Iraqis thought it would be impossible to move large forces in this way and thus set up their defenses toward major roads, only to be hit in the flanks by surprise attacks from the deserts. The importance of GPS has only increased since then, but so have incidents of GPS jamming and spoofing. From Ukraine to the Middle East and the South China Sea, GPS jamming and spoofing has affected everything from militaries to civilian traffic. Base systems have developed a digital GPS anti-jamming receiver, which is quickly proliferating across Western militaries, but the US has banked on encode GPS tech to make its weapons resilient to jamming. Basically, GPS 3.0, encode utilizes a new type of signal to make it much more difficult for GPS signals to be spoofed or completely jammed. It'll be transmitted in the same frequency ranges as old GPS, but users will only need part of the signal to anonymously calculate their position. GPS 3 satellites will also be able to broadcast spot coverage and regional coverage, making it extremely difficult to disrupt an incoming signal. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the US's need to purchase anti-jamming equipment and jam-resistant add-ons in its arsenal, as well as the deployment of M-code. Unfortunately, satellite launches are significantly behind schedule, and the US won't be able to make full use of its new GPS tech for years to come. The US has been carefully analyzing Russia's failures in Ukraine, an exhausting job for whoever got it, and two major points of failure have become clear. The first is a lack of battlefield command and control, with Russian military leadership often far in the rear or simply not having the tools or capabilities to coordinate a large number of troop formations at once. The second major failure is a lack of initiative by Russian troops, and this is a result of two things: low morale and poor doctrine. The US prides itself on having a force that is extremely resilient to command disruption. Junior leaders at every level are encouraged to act on their own initiative, creating a military that is highly resistant to the type of decapitation strikes Ukraine is delivering every other day. Russia, on the other hand, is the opposite, with its military entrenched in old Soviet doctrine of a heavy top-down command structure. Troops do as the higher command tells them to, and if higher command doesn't exist anymore because the general used his cell phone to call home and then Ukraine responded with a Storm Shadow strike, then they do nothing. It's never been clearer to the US that it must maintain its competitive advantage by fostering the type of carpe diem attitude that's been its hallmark since World War I. Renewed focus on NCO and junior leader training attempts to insulate US command chains from decapitation strikes. And with the proliferation of electronic warfare and radio jamming, US units must be able to operate on their own while being out of contact for prolonged periods of time. This means more individual and junior leader training, and to counter the same morale problem that's plaguing the Russian military, the daily allotment of HUAs in the US military has been increased threefold. The Ukrainian war has shown that US combat vehicle design might be outdated as well, though, and it's been scrambling to correct that mistake. The greatest killer of tanks in Ukraine has been the anti-tank missile, with a combination of landmines and artillery being a close second. Tank-on-tank combat accounts for only a fraction of total tank kills, as the anti-tank guided missile has proven it is the king of killing tanks, especially if you have awful armor doctrine like Russia and don't properly support them with dismounted infantry. Most anti-tank missiles work by attacking the thin top armor of a tank, often penetrating the turret and delivering a shaped rod of molten metal which punches into the tank and does very unkind things to any crew in the way. The US has taken note of the way Russian tanks have been savaged by ATGMs and now believes that it's time for some significant redesign of the legendary Abrams tank. It might look like America's taking a page from Russia's book, except it was the US who originally pioneered the concept of a remotely controlled turret. This is what the Abrams might be bringing to the table in its next iteration, as it moves its vulnerable crew out of the turret and into an armored capsule at the front of the tank. All the way back in 1980, the US experimented with the concept, but because the height of technology at the time was the Sony Walkman, it was deemed too immature a concept to risk bringing to the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Thus, the US opted for traditional turrets on top of the Abrams. But that's changing as the US looks at the use of a remote-controlled turret once more. This would make the crew safer even from an anti-tank missile, as it moves them out of the likely path of penetration. It also means the US will have to adopt an autoloader, however, something that it hasn't wanted to do so far. But in the end, America might not have a choice, because even though the ATGM protective measures are becoming increasingly more advanced, the fact of the matter is that the Abrams tank is already too fat for its own good. And studies from Ukraine show that to be survivable, the tank as it is going to have to put on even more pounds. Modern Abrams tanks are already too heavy for safe transport on many different types of vehicles, and far too heavy to safely cross most bridges. Adding more weight for more protective measures simply isn't an option, but the Abrams might have to take on the weight of additional countermeasures by adopting a remote-controlled turret. Such a turret could be made much smaller than a traditional turret and be less well armored as there's no crew inside to protect. This would allow the tank to shed tons of pounds and come down to something a bit more manageable for US logisticians. Tank manufacturer General Dynamics already revealed its Abrams X program back in March 2023, featuring a remote-controlled turret that could be the future of the legendary Abrams. Ukraine has delivered one final lesson to the US military, and it's one with a significance so important that the US has taken unprecedented action to immediately meet the challenge. It's estimated that Ukraine uses up to 10,000 drones a month. This includes drones lost to anti-drone weapons and jamming, as well as suicide drones used to deliver explosive love letters to the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow. On September 20th, Ukraine launched the largest drone attack in history, using over 100 drones to attack Russian defenses and facilities in Crimea. The attack was a stunning success, with the drones drawing the attention of Russian air defenses and forcing them to expend their missiles. The attritable swarm then continued onto its various targets and opened up the skies for Neptune missiles to strike at the Russian naval HQ. From attriting enemy air defenses to recon and spotting for artillery, drones are the weapon of the war, and the US has realized just how critical these sometimes very small weapons are for fighting a modern conflict. Despite being completely overmatched in every category, Ukraine's advantage in drones has been one of its biggest saving graces, and it's used that overmatch to make life absolutely miserable for the Russians. Aircraft and radar systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars have been destroyed or severely damaged by $1,000 drones, and that's an economic exchange that no country can hope to win. The US has prioritized anti-drone weapons across the entire military. In any future conflict, it's inevitable that enemy agents will strike far behind the front lines using disposable drones. The B-2 bomber is the world's second most capable bomber, now that its successor, the B-21, is operational, but it can easily be destroyed by a 3-ship flight of a $200 DJI drone equipped with explosives and launched from close to its flight line.
Everything from multi-million-dollar aircraft and systems to civilian infrastructure is vulnerable to drone attacks, and point drone defense weapons are a critical need for the American military. But traditional point defense weapons use expensive interceptors, and that's simply not an option. Again, swapping million-dollar Patriot missiles for $1,000 drones is a quick way to lose a war. Instead, the US is turning to directed energy weapons, and it's already fielding the most powerful battlefield lasers in the world with more to come. But the drone itself is a weapon supremely useful not just to overmatched powers like Ukraine, but even the world's most powerful military. In a stunning announcement, the US Department of Defense announced the Replicator program, aimed at producing and fielding, quote, thousands upon thousands, end quote, of drones in the US military by 2025. That's just 2 years, and the US is expecting to have massive drone swarms not just in inventory but in active use. Drone swarms are supremely useful, as Ukraine has proven, and the US has named a specific adversary for its future drones: China. Citing China's growing number superiority in the Pacific, the DoD is turning to vast swarms of drones to level the playing field, and then tip it in its advantage. These drones will do everything from recon to saturating enemy defenses and even delivering suicide attacks. And Replicator aims to have vast quantities of expendable drones for use in both sky and sea. America is an apt pupil of war, and the Ukraine war has been a masterclass on the challenges of future combat and how ill-prepared in places the US and its allies have been. However, the advantage of the United States military over any potential adversary is its dedication to professional military education with the best war colleges in the world, where US service members attend class side by side with allies and partners from around the world. If the US is going to keep its competitive advantage, though, it's got to keep evolving and avoid letting any amount of hubris stagnate its military culture. The United States military casts a long shadow with military bases or troops in more than 70 countries. It's spread across the world with over 800 total military bases. So, why does the United States have military bases in so many countries? Is it an invited guest or that holiday house guest who just won't leave? The question is more complicated than it looks. For one thing, all 6 branches of the military have bases abroad. Yes, including the Space Force. The newest branch of the US military has a base at Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, north of the Arctic Circle. This is a useful location because it hosts missile warning systems that have an easier time scanning the globe for threats from its position near the North Pole. While it primarily serves as a satellite base, over 3,000 flights land there each year. Even the Coast Guard gets in on the action. This division of the US military rarely sees combat and primarily patrols sea traffic and ports. Even so, the US needs to keep its interests secure abroad. It has a heavy presence in Bahrain, which is at the center of a conflict in the Middle East, as well as Saudi Arabia, Germany, Japan, the UK, the Netherlands, and Singapore, as well as the always controversial military base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. But that's nothing compared to the bigger branches. The United States Army, the first and biggest branch of the armed forces, is also the most widespread. Many of its foreign bases date back to the World Wars or even earlier, and it can be found in Belgium, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Germany, Italy, Kosovo, and Lithuania in Europe. In Asia, it has bases in Japan, Kuwait, Israel, Iraq, and a whole network of bases in South Korea. It even has a beachhead in Africa thanks to a small contingency site in Cameroon. What about the few, the proud, the Marines? The Marine Corps doesn't have as many members as the Army, being treated as an elite squad of the toughest fighters who can serve as all-purpose teams. That means that they're limited to only a few locations around the world, many of which have been the center of some of the world's worst conflicts. Today, they can be found in Japan, Germany, and South Korea. They're also stationed on the U.S. territory of Guam. Now let's look to the seas. The Navy patrols the seas, so most locations of U.S. Navy bases are likely to be based near ports, but not all of them. The Navy has a presence in the Bahamas, Bahrain, Djibouti, Greece, Italy, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Spain. It also has support locations in Poland and Romania, and connection with the United Kingdom and the British Indian Ocean Territory, and a former location in Iceland. And the Navy has a base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, complicating that situation even more. And now it's time to take to the skies. The Air Force has one of the biggest footprints around the world, with U.S. planes being located in Estonia, Germany, Honduras, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Kuwait, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Romania, South Korea, Cyprus, Turkey, and several key bases in the United Kingdom. It's also based in territories like Aruba and Curaçao, both run by allies of the United States. That's a lot of bases, and the U.S. got there in different ways. For one thing, not all of them belong to the U.S. alone.
There's one other major category of U.S. military bases abroad: joint bases, where the U.S. operates a military complex in conjunction with an ally nation. Many of these do contain regular troops, but they're also often used for top-secret weapons tests and other research. Such sites can be found in Guam, where the United States collaborates with Palau and Micronesia, as well as in Iraq and Syria. But probably the most significant of these is in Australia, where American forces have a long-standing arrangement and few diplomatic issues. As Australia has a massive amount of space in the outback, the U.S. has been leasing land there for weapons research for decades. The largest of all of these sites is Pine Gap, a massive satellite surveillance base. The closest town is 11 miles away, and it's run by the CIA and NSA. But how did the U.S. manage to set up bases in countries which weren't excited about the U.S. intervention? The first reason is pretty obvious. The U.S. military isn't easy to turn away. Many of these bases were established in the aftermath of a war, particularly in Germany and Japan. In World War II, the Allies had a lengthy occupation of the Axis powers after they were defeated and established military bases to keep peace. Their establishment was part of the treaty signed by the defeated nations after the war, and the new leadership had a vested interest in U.S. presence deterring the representatives of the defeated government from trying anything. Then, of course, the Cold War ramped up, and both Germany and Japan found themselves uncomfortably close to communist countries. Having U.S. soldiers stationed on their territory suddenly seemed like a very good idea. And then there are the more recent wars. The Korean War ended in a stalemate, not a victory, a rare occurrence for the U.S. at the time. So the new status quo had a heavily armed US-backed South Korea squaring off against a heavily armed communist-backed North Korea. That led to the establishment of dozens of US military bases in South Korea to help maintain the demilitarized zone and provide a deterrent against North Korean invasion. As the situation in the peninsula has changed little since the 1950s, most of these installations still exist today, making South Korea one of the countries with the highest number of active US soldiers stationed there today. But not all U.S. bases are there to counter an external threat. When the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 terror attacks and 2 years later invaded Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein, it pretty quickly set up military bases in both. The extended occupations included training the local security forces to keep the peace once they were gone, but insurgencies in both countries complicated situations. The U.S. still technically has several military bases in Iraq, although control of them was transferred to the Iraqi government in the most recent troop withdrawal, and they now operate as contingency bases. In Afghanistan, the government's hasty withdrawal in 2021 led to U.S. bases being abandoned and seized by the Taliban, the very same forces the U.S. invaded to depose 20 years earlier. But sometimes the U.S. is asked to build a base in a host country. The United States doesn't always initiate conflicts. Sometimes the war is already raging when the U.S. gets involved as part of a coalition. That was the case in 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded the small oil-rich country of Kuwait. The massive response to this became known as the Gulf War, and in the end, Saddam was fully routed, although it would kick off an extended rivalry between the Iraqi dictator and the U.S. that would last over a decade until his death. But in the process, the U.S. established bases in Kuwait and other nearby nations, some of which still exist today, and were largely welcomed as a barrier of protection. However, one of these bases was particularly controversial, as this base was hosted in Saudi Arabia. Many radicals thought that U.S. presence on Saudi Arabian soil was a desecration. One of those radicals? The terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden. A similar situation arose later that decade when ethnic and religious conflict in the Balkans boiled over. As the region of Kosovo battled for independence from Serbia, the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, escalated his campaign of mass murder against the Bosnian Muslims in multiple countries. A large coalition of countries united to drive Milosevic out of power, and he eventually faced trial at The Hague. But that didn't stop the conflict, as Serbia and Kosovo are in a constant state of Cold War. The United States has maintained a presence in Kosovo, one of the world's newest countries, to make sure the Cold War doesn't turn hot. And then there's another way the U.S. gets its bases into other countries: good old-fashioned cash. How exactly did the U.S. get a base on Cuba, given the two countries have been bitter enemies for 60 years? It all goes back to 1903, when the U.S. and Spain went to war. Cuba was one of the key battlefields, with Spain eventually ceding control of the island in the Treaty of Paris. The United States was a strong supporter of Cuba's independence, and in the aftermath they cut a deal where the government of Cuba would lend or sell land to the U.S. for bases that would be used to protect Cuba's independence. While there was some initial controversy in Cuba, most likely because they were worried about winding up under another colonial thumb, the land for Guantanamo Bay was leased in 1903. and the US has had a military presence there ever since. And while the communist government established in the Cuban Revolution has claimed the US is illegally occupying the land, the US has responded, "Check the contract." So it seems pretty clear that the United States is firmly entrenched in foreign countries. But what does that mean in practice? With the exception of active war zones and occupation zones, most US soldiers stationed abroad in military bases aren't engaged in combat. Rather, they spend their days maintaining military equipment, training and engaging in drills, testing new gear, and preparing to defend the region if need be. That's why many bases are in locations that are just short of a potential combat zone, such as the many bases in Germany, which is a member of NATO, and Japan, which could become a potential flashpoint should China move on Taiwan. It's believed that between 160,000 and 180,000 of the United States active duty personnel are stationed around the world. And as for how the country they're stationed in feels about it, it's a complicated issue. There are actually a lot of reasons why countries might want the US stationed on their territory. For one thing, it provides a lot of national defense security. You're playing host to the most effective and highly trained military in the world, with the best gear money can buy. And the US military does not like losses on its resume, so you can bet any country that has a US base on its territory will have some great security. Many people feel like the US is the biggest bully on the world playground, but if you've got the biggest bully on the playground as your best friend, all the other bullies will think twice about picking a fight with you. And it's also good for relations with the US. Hosting a US military base is seen as the ultimate investment in a diplomatic relationship with the United States, and it sends a clear sign to your neighbors that you have a tight relationship with the world's only superpower. A good example of this is Israel, a small but powerful country that relies heavily on access to US military technology. The presence of a US military base is a good investment diplomatically for the tiny Middle Eastern nation, and ensures that regardless of the current US president, the superpower will still be committed to ensuring Israel's safety. A country that hosts a US military base is likely to be first in line for any future trade deals, especially for military technology. And in some cases, the government relies directly on the US for national defense. You don't get out of starting World War II without paying a heavy price, and in the aftermath of the war, Germany and Japan were essentially disarmed, with strict regulations put on their future military development. While Germany has since beefed up its military quite a bit, Japan has a strictly pacifist constitution that limits its military to being a strictly defensive one. As such, the United States has essentially taken control of Japan's national security, an arrangement that continues to this day, with Japan playing host to a large number of American troops that guard it from foreign enemies. It's an unusual arrangement, but one that both countries are happy with. And it's not just the United States. Hosting military bases for other nations is fairly common, with countries lending out or leasing space as a way to show faith in their diplomatic relationships. So abroad, there's a cultural norm to allow friendly nations a place to set up their military bases. The one exception? The United States, which is the most powerful country in the world and has little reason to extend a welcome sign to other militaries. Its geographic isolation is also a reason why it doesn't really host foreign militaries. It only borders two countries. Mexico has little international military presence, and Canada's military has more than enough space to work and train in Canada, the second largest country in the world. And there's one other massive reason why countries might want the US military on their soil. The United States has 55,000 soldiers deployed in Japan, the highest of any nation. The second busiest country is Germany with over 36,000, South Korea has around 25,000, and Italy is in fourth with 12,000. That's a large population that needs food and has money to spend on leisure. And there's only so much you can do on a military base, so they fan out and spend their money in local towns, boosting the economy. In fact, several towns in Germany are essentially dependent on US soldiers spending their cash. And when there was discussion of shutting down some of the bases, the locals protested because it would lead to many businesses closing. And in some cases, the United States military presence might be the only thing protecting a country against an aggressor. Possibly the thorniest situation where the US maintains a consistent presence is South Korea, where war is always just short of breaking out with the Communist North. Kim Jong-un has escalated his belligerence in recent years, even shooting ballistic missiles over Japan and triggering an attack alarm in the process. He has a reputation for being unstable, and as the only nuclear power on the peninsula, he might be tempted to invade and try to complete the mission his grandfather failed to achieve back in the 1950s. So what's stopping him? The world's biggest guard team, the US military. Those 25,000 soldiers may not be actively engaged in the demilitarized zone, which is staffed by Korean troops, but any attack on South Korea would mean US troops are in harm's way. The small US contingent on the peninsula would quickly jump in to help the South Koreans. But it's not all smooth sailing. Not everyone is happy with having a U.S. presence on their soil, even if the country is overall friendly. Cuba is one of the few countries to outright demand the U.S. leave, and were quickly rebuffed. But most countries have some sort of movement against the troop presence on their soil. This is usually limited to overall negative feelings about war and the military, with anti-war activists often arguing that the presence of the United States military makes them more likely to get attacked, not less. They usually have little power to impact the government's decision, but a dramatic shift in the government could lead to contracts being redrawn. And sometimes the conflict is more personal. Playing host to the U.S. military means you've got top-tier military equipment and protection, but it also means you're hosting a whole bunch of soldiers, not all of which might be good apples. The soldiers often go out into the local towns and party during leave, and in most cases, the worst that'll mean is a drunken disorderly charge and a whole lot of push-ups back at base. But in some cases, the soldiers cross the line, and soldiers have been accused of assaults, murders, and sex crimes while stationed abroad. In many cases, if the evidence is strong, the government will turn the soldiers over to be prosecuted by a friendly government if they can trust that that government will treat them fairly. But many times, soldiers have gotten away with being accused of crimes, and that leads to greater tension as locals start to feel like the benefits of the U.S. presence isn't worth the risk. But if push comes to shove, is there any way to get the United States to actually leave? The main way you're going to get the U.S. out of your country is if they want to leave, and that has happened a few times. The Iraq War was deeply unpopular, and Barack Obama was elected to draw down the war and bring the troops home. It took a long time, but eventually all the bases were turned over to the friendly Iraqi government, and are still on occasion used with permission to hunt down agents of the terrorist group ISIL. In the case of Afghanistan, the evacuation was much more hurried, and the government at the time collapsed in the days after the withdrawal, which shows that when the US wants out, they'll get out as fast as they can, and you can't make them stay any more than you can make them leave. But other situations are far more tense. The United States has been in a state of Cold War with Cuba for over 60 years, and it nearly turned hot several times, especially after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuba's hands are largely tied by the contracts the previous government signed, and few other countries are willing to pick a fight with the U.S. over a single military base, so Cuba's allies aren't going to help it get rid of the U.S. presence at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba is the only country actively hosting a military base in protest, as most other cases where the U.S. set up shop after a military conflict either had the government agree to the presence or had the U.S. set up across the border from an enemy like in Kosovo. But if a country actually wanted to get rid of their U.S. base, would they have any luck? For one thing, it matters where it is. The term sphere of influence has got a lot of play over the years, as countries view any encroachment into their region as a threat. This has gotten the most attention in Europe, as Russia has created a doctrine that threatens NATO if it should expand into former communist land. But the US has a sphere of influence too, and it claims all of North America as its region, which is another reason why no one's going to help Cuba displace the US from its soil. But what if another country wanted to end its relationship with the US? Would it have any cards to play? For one thing, a binding order to leave the military base would have to come from the United Nations, unless the US simply agreed. And while the UN passes many resolutions each year, few have any legal binding unless they come from the UN Security Council, which has a rotating membership and 5 permanent members, each of which has a veto power over any resolution. Those permanent members are Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So good luck passing that anti-US resolution. And sometimes, even if the country is opposed, loopholes can be found. Many countries that were founded in the midst of an anti-colonial movement set up constitutions that explicitly banned other countries from establishing bases on their soil. Others had an isolationist movement and set up new laws later. But anything is possible when a new government comes to power, and several countries saw their constitutions essentially shredded when a US-friendly government wanted to curry favor with the superpower. It would be as simple as building an unofficial facility that isn't officially a US base but allows soldiers to train there. These have even taken the form of golf courses owned by the military. And getting rid of a base isn't easy. It's not as simple as asking the US to leave and then reaping the benefits. All the property on the bases belongs to the federal government, which means the government would likely strip it clean if they decided to abandon it. The only exception is if the US agrees to hand the base over to a friendly government like in Iraq, or if they abandon in a hurry like in Afghanistan. This is especially unlikely if the country they're leaving is seen as a strategic rival, as the US would never hand over classified military technology to a potential enemy. And if a country did manage to convince the US to leave, the odds are it would permanently damage their relationship with the world's most powerful country. And in terms of global military reach, the US truly stands alone. The US spends more on its military than any other country in the world, more than twice as much in fact. and a chunk of that goes to staffing and maintaining those bases overseas. The result is that the US has more bases abroad than every other country combined, and you can bet any other country would hesitate to establish a military base where the US already has one, which might explain why the US is so hesitant to abandon any of their bases. As long as they have the longest reach in the world, a lot of other countries won't even get close. So the end result paints a pretty clear picture. U.S. military bases improve diplomatic relations with the host country, provide access to U.S. defense resources, deter enemies from potentially invading, and even provide a healthy boon to the local economy. On the other hand, dislodging a U.S. base is near impossible, can't be achieved through the United Nations, and would bring diplomatic and strategic fallout with the U.S. So it looks like this bald eagle isn't leaving the nest anytime soon.
The United States Navy and the United States Coast Guard. For anyone not in the know, they might be curious as to what the real difference is between the two services. After all, they both pretty much just operate out at sea, and they both use military caliber vessels. So what's the real difference between the two? And why do we even need a Coast Guard? Why doesn't the Navy just do both jobs itself? In 1790, the United States was facing a dire naval situation. Its shores were being regularly ravaged by pirate vessels, many of which were sponsored by Britain. In an attempt to protect its increasingly important overseas trade, the United States Congress authorized a proposal by the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, to build a fleet of 10 cutters. This date, August 4, 1790, is officially recognized as the birthday of the United States Coast Guard. And within 3 years, the nascent Coast Guard, then known as the Revenue Cutter Service, had seen its first anti-piracy action. When war broke out with France in 1798, revenue cutters made up about 1/3 of the total U.S. fleet. Though incredibly, they ended up seizing 18 out of 20 vessels captured by the U.S. ships during the war. During the subsequent War of 1812, revenue cutters clashed with British vessels, and in one engagement, the crew of an ambushed American cutter fought so ferociously that the British captain of the attacking vessel returned the revenue cutter's sword to her captain in tribute to the skill of his fighting men. It wouldn't be until 1915 that the U.S. Coast Guard got its official namesake, when the Life-Saving Service, a system of patrol ships dispatched to rescue sailors in distress, and the Revenue Cutter Service were merged together into one service. On the 6th of April 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, and the Navy broadcasted Plan 1 Acknowledge to all Coast Guard bases and stations, officially transferring control of all U.S. Coast Guard assets to the U.S. Navy for the duration of the war. In support of the war, 6 Coast Guard cutters were dispatched to Europe for convoy escort duties, while smaller vessels patrolled the waters off the American coast in search for German subs. This would be mirrored 2 decades later when the U.S. Navy once more assumed control over the Coast Guard and its vessels. In both wars, Coast Guard ships defended convoys from German subs and suffered losses of ships and sailors in attacks. The U.S. Navy was officially established on October 13, 1775. Despite being outgunned by the mighty British Royal Navy, America has historically had a rich naval tradition, given the vast amount of trade it engages in with overseas powers. This meant that the rebel colonies had a rich pool of experienced sailors, captains, and shipbuilders, and in little time the first vessels of the Continental Navy were putting out to sea. Despite being overwhelmingly outgunned by superior British vessels, American captains nevertheless managed to secure several strategic wins, or turn British victories into Pyrrhic victories with little true value. After winning the Revolutionary War, the United States disbanded its navy as it could not afford to keep it financed. Without the funds to pay tribute to the Barbary states, the nations that made up the north coast of Africa, American ships were plundered by Barbary pirates. The situation only grew worse when in 1793 a truce was negotiated between Portugal and Algiers, which ended Portugal's blockade of the Strait of Gibraltar and allowed the Barbary pirates to escape the Mediterranean. As a result, 11 American vessels and their crews were captured and sold into slavery. This led the U.S. Congress to approve the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the building of 6 frigates. In 1798, when war was declared on France, the U.S. Navy was officially re-established. After fending off French vessels during the war, the Barbary pirate states declared open war on the U.S. in 1801, when the U.S. refused to pay tribute. This led the U.S. Navy to conduct the first foreign conquest of an enemy state, battling Barbary ships in Tripoli and landing a contingent of American Marines to capture the city of Derna. During the War of 1812 against the British, the U.S. Navy found itself greatly outgunned and outnumbered by the Royal Navy. As a result, most of her best ships were blockaded in port, and many were captured by ground assaults and burned at the docks. Despite this, the U.S. Navy managed to capture several British ships, and even had a brief but highly successful campaign against British merchant ships in the Pacific. Key victories in the Great Lakes by the U.S. Navy denied the British several key strategic concessions during the negotiations for peace, and these victories ensured that the U.S. Navy would remain fully funded even after the war was over. At last, the United States would have a respectable and full-time Navy. During the American Civil War, the Union Navy completely dominated the Confederate Navy, and the blockade of southern ports proved devastating to the Confederacy, hasting along the end of the war. It would be this war, however, when the world would witness the effects of battle between two ironclads, new ships that were fully armored with metal plating for the first time. On March 9, 1862, the whole world acknowledged that wooden ships were officially obsolete, as Union and Confederate ironclads attacked each other while tearing through the wooden-hulled ships of both sides. The U.S. Navy would sadly decline until just prior to World War I, when it became the second most powerful navy in the world after the Royal Navy. With World War II, though, the U.S. surpassed the Royal Navy and officially became the most powerful navy on Earth. Today, the American Navy remains head and shoulders ahead of its nearest competitors and is matched by no other navy anywhere. So now that we know about the two services, just what is the difference between the two, really? Well, essentially both services have a similar but distinct job. The U.S. Coast Guard is America's primary enforcer of maritime law, a task that the U.S. Navy may occasionally assist with but does not actively partake in. The Coast Guard's civil duties are multiple, and they're responsible for their age-old tradition of maintaining lighthouses, buoys, and other navigational aids for civilian traffic. Although, admittedly, the only lighthouses in official operation today are automated. The Coast Guard routinely monitors ship traffic to ensure that all vessels of all sizes are obeying proper maritime rules and regulations. They also help keep traffic manageable at some of the world's busiest ports, as well as combat smuggling and illegal immigration by searching for stowaways or responding to a ship who's discovered them hidden on board. Famously, the U.S. Coast Guard is the primary deterrent to drug smuggling on the ocean and operates a fleet of about 200 cutters and smaller patrol craft to chase down suspected smugglers. Recently, a video of Coast Guard officers stopping a drug smuggling submarine has gone viral, and this is the job the Coasties do every day. The Coast Guard, however, is also responsible for responding to disasters at sea. When your ship is going down in rough waters and you desperately need help, it's the Coast Guard who will come to rescue the day. No matter what nationality you are, as long as you're in American waters, you have a guardian angel on your side, and that's a Coast Guard helicopter carrying rescue divers who have one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. However, in wartime, the Coast Guard can also be called upon to supplement the abilities of the U.S. Navy. While today its national security cutters aren't equipped with the heavy long-range firepower needed to take on most military vessels, they still pack a formidable wallop with a 57mm gun, a 20mm Phalanx Sea Whiz for close-range defense against drones, small boats and anti-ship missiles, and 4 50 caliber machine guns and 4 7.62 caliber machine guns. The real strength of each cutter, though, is the robust suite of communications and intelligence sensors, which allow a ship to act as eyes and ears for Navy ships anywhere within their theater of operations. A national security cutter may lack the heavy firepower to go toe-to-toe with a modern warship, but it has everything it needs to target an enemy vessel and call in a strike from a friendly naval vessel. In essence, the U.S. Coast Guard is responsible for the coasts and various waterways of the United States. In a war, they can supplement the U.S. Navy and ensure that any enemy combatant entering or even approaching American territorial waters, or those of Canada or Mexico, is quickly engaged by nearby Navy vessels or land-based air power. The U.S. Navy's core mission is pretty much the exact opposite of the Coast Guard, and their primary wartime objective is to ensure that no enemy force ever sets foot on American soil. To achieve this, it operates the largest fleet of surface and subsurface vessels anywhere in the world, and the U.S. Navy on its own is more powerful than its next dozen competitors put together. A nation with a rich maritime tradition, the U.S. has long put an emphasis on a strong Navy, and it now sees the Navy as the primary peacekeeping tool in its toolbox. The U.S. Navy's real mission, however, is to ensure global stability and flow of free trade, figuring that as long as the world was busy trading with itself, it wouldn't want to go to war and disrupt lucrative trade with its neighbors. To To this end, the American Navy has a global presence to help reassure weaker powers that their merchant vessels won't be harassed, whether by pirates or hostile foreign nations. Where once tribute was demanded of seagoing vessels by various rogue or national states, today the world enjoys global free trade thanks to the U.S. Navy and its NATO allies. To achieve its objectives, the U.S. Navy operates the largest force of aircraft carriers in the world, totaling at 10 Nimitz-class carriers and one of the brand new Gerald R. Ford class. The naval air power of the American Navy combined with that of the U.S. Marine Corps makes it the second largest air force in the world. These aircraft carriers are themselves supplemented by 9 amphibious assault ships, formerly known as amphibious assault carriers. These were typically helicopter carriers equipped with amphibious landing craft, but now sport vertical takeoff or short takeoff and landing aircraft. 10 amphibious transport docks can land hundreds of American troops at any time, anywhere in the world within days of hostilities breaking out. And a further 2 are under construction as tensions with China in the South Pacific rise. A further 12 dock landing ships supplements America's already prodigious amphibious forces. And given that the U.S. has total dominance in its own global hemisphere, it only makes sense that it places so much emphasis on having a Navy capable of conducting expeditionary amphibious landings. If you've seen our video on the United States versus the world, then you already know that it's exactly this lack of transport capability that would allow the U.S. Navy to fight the world's navies to a standstill and make an invasion of the Americas impossible. To knock enemy ships out of the water, though, the U.S. Navy has a fleet of 22 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, each armed with dozens of various types of missiles, ranging from fleet air defense to anti-ship and even dual purpose. The backbone of the Navy's surface power, however, comes from its fleet of 67 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and 2 Zumwalt stealth destroyers currently deployed. These ships do exactly as their name implies and are the heaviest surface combatants since the retirement of battleships by the world's navies. Prowling under the waves all around the world is the deadliest submarine fleet in the world, with 35 Los Angeles attack subs, 3 Seawolf-class subs, 15 Virginia-class subs, and 14 Ohio-class subs. While its anti-submarine capabilities severely atrophied after the end of the Cold War, the U.S. still fields the most advanced subs in the world and are considered just as stealthy as new diesel-electric subs being fielded today by smaller navies. Unlike diesel-electric subs, though, nuclear submarines offer a far greater endurance and allow the U.S. Navy to engage enemies far from home and threaten hostile fleets in their own territorial waters. The U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy could be seen as 2 branches on the same tree, but have markedly different mission sets. While both in peacetime and war, the services lend aid to each other and support each other's missions, ultimately the U.S. Navy is considered the bigger cousin, and it's likely that in another major conflict, the Coast Guard would once more fall under the Navy's jurisdiction. For the second time in its history, the U.S. is poised to lose another war against China. But this time, the entire current world order is at stake. During the Korean War, the influx of hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops surprised American and NATO military planners who were caught completely off guard. While the U.S. technically did not lose against China, in fact it scored truly apocalyptic losses on Chinese infantry, the U.S. also didn't win the war, resulting in the current status quo on the peninsula. South Korea remains a strong U.S. ally and economically powerful liberal democracy, while Kim Jong-un rules the north and hurls missiles into the ocean to keep Godzilla at bay. Sure, some of you will claim there's no such thing as Godzilla and Kim's just a madman developing a nuclear weapons program, but riddle us this: why hasn't there been a single confirmed Godzilla sighting since North Korea began launching missiles into the Pacific? This time, the US and China are set to go head-to-head in a war that will absolutely dwarf the clash between the US and Chinese troops in Korea. And this one's for all the marbles, boys and girls, because the victor is guaranteed to shape the 21st century. If the US wins, the global status quo will remain the same. If China wins, an autocratic world order will almost certainly replace the current liberal one. And if it doesn't, it'll hurl the world into a fresh ideological conflict that'll make the Cold War look like the Anglo-Zanzibar War. This might sound like a lot of hyperbole, but the truth is the US and China represent 2 completely different visions for the global future. The United States is the dominant global power, and it certainly has its flaws. But it's a train that can be steered and course-corrected, with the historical global trend being toward a more liberal world order. China's very survival depends on upending liberal democracies who represent an existential threat to the iron grip of the Chinese Communist Party. Already, the difficulties of assimilating Hong Kong and Macau into the mainland communist government hint at a China where people are increasingly growing tired of the CCP's yoke. Eliminating all other alternatives altogether is one way to placate the masses. The linchpin of Chinese ambitions to break the US-led world order rests with Taiwan, And unfortunately for the US, that means China has all the advantages. This little island nation played a relatively minor role throughout the 20th century, but it's set to define the 21st century and beyond. The island nation is just offshore mainland China and enjoys a robust, healthy democracy that thrives even under the long, dark shadow of the Chinese Communist Party. China believes that the breakaway republic still belongs in the fold of the CCP and has repeatedly stated it will use force to reunify. Continued independence is simply not an option. So the die is cast, and an invasion seems inevitable. But why does the fate of this little island matter to the world? For one, Taiwan enjoys the protection of what's come to be called the Silicon Shield. Back in the 80s, as the US moved the manufacturing of microchips overseas where they could be produced more cheaply, Taiwan saw an opportunity. The nation invested heavily into building infrastructure to produce semiconductors and soon became a world leader in manufacturing them. With the United States Navy being the most powerful force on Earth, there was little concern over a hostile China next door to the world's largest supply of computer chips. But that calculus has changed, and where once the US could sail its carrier strike groups right past Chinese shores with no concerns, now it has to face a rapidly modernizing and expanding Chinese military. This puts Taiwan in serious jeopardy, and with it, the world's largest supplier of the most advanced computer chips on the planet. With the CCP in control of Taiwan's semiconductor production, it'll have the leverage to blackmail any nation it wishes, even America. Under threat of sanction, nations will have to carefully weigh how they respond to the CCP requests, or watch their economy crumble for a lack of computer chips. We've had a taste of this future with the shortage prompted by the COVID crisis, which for many was a wake-up call to the threat the world order currently faces. Secondly, Taiwan is part of the First Island Chain, a string of islands stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down to the Philippines and beyond. This chain of pro-US nations acts as a barrier and historically has contained the communist powers of the Soviet Union and China. This has left the US Navy as the guarantor of global trade security, and it's thanks to the US naval dominance that the world enjoys free, predictable, and stable trade for the first time in history. China breaking this First Island Chain shifts global power dramatically, as its warships will be able to freely come and go as they please and maneuver strategically important waterways, like the Malacca Straits, where if they so choose, they can influence global trade as they wish. With Taiwan as the linchpin of any war between the US and China, this unfortunately leaves China with all the advantages, or at least most of them, because China is making one key error. Faced with the prospect of the United States effectively containing its forces via the First Island Chain, China has two options. The first is to attempt to break the chain militarily, as we seem to be on an inevitable course for. The second, however, is to break the chain diplomatically. Rather than expend military resources and capital in a confrontation with the US and its allies, China could leverage its massive economy and turn it into diplomatic pressure. For its part, China's attempted to do this. It alone holds the leash on North Korea, and it has pursued much closer economic ties with nations in Southeast Asia. This leaves South Korea's fate unknown in case the US and China go to war. Once it would have been a steadfast ally to the US, but its defense treaty with the United States does not compel it to go to war over Taiwan with its ally. With China already punishing South Korea economically over the deployment of US THAAD ballistic missile defenses on its soil in 2017, South Korea may not be looking to break its relationship with such a huge trading partner. And if South Korea reneges on its defensive partnership with the US over Taiwan, the American people may find themselves questioning why they've invested so much in defending the South for 70 years. But with other US partners, China's been far less successful. In fact, it's made some seriously egregious missteps. Once it looked set to spin Australia away from US influence with a robust charm offensive, which came to a crashing halt when the Australians discovered how deeply China had penetrated Australian political and educational institutions. China had been secretly working to influence the Australian youth and politics alike to be pro-CCP, and its continued aggression in the South China Sea was seen as an inevitable threat to Australian interests. When Australia called for an investigation into the origin of COVID, which looked into evidence of the virus being man-made and leaked in a lab by China, relations soured even further, leading to a trade war between the two nations. It's with the Philippines, though, that China's misstepped the most, and it could have just handed the US the keys to victory. Much like in Australia, China also waged a charm offensive against the Philippines and heavily courted the nation's last president, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte was a populist autocrat who came to power on promises to crack down on violent crime and drugs. To his credit, he did just that by launching one of the largest campaigns of police brutality and abuse of the modern era. The International Criminal Court is currently considering an investigation into Duterte's campaign against crime and drugs based on reported hundreds of extrajudicial killings and even more beatings during his reign. Duterte also cracked down on political opposition as best he could, given that the Philippines was still a democracy, much to his chagrin. In short, Duterte was the kind of man China could do business with, a fellow autocrat with deeply anti-democratic sentiments. Relations between the U.S. and the Philippines soured during this time, as U.S. President Barack Obama called out Duterte for the extrajudicial killings that he was overseeing during his campaign against crime. The Philippines and China began to grow closer, and the future of the U.S.-Filipino defensive alliance was in serious question. This would have been a disaster for the balance of power in the Pacific, effectively allowing China to break a large chunk of the First Island chain without firing a shot. Even more importantly, it denied the U.S. one thing it needs the most: bases close to China. This is America's biggest weakness in the Pacific. While China can base all air and naval power at once right on its own shores, the U.S. is forced to fight an entire ocean away from its home. This severely limits the amount of firepower the U.S. can bring to a fight, as well as complicating logistics and slowing down the pace and intensity of combat operations. Traditionally, the U.S. has relied on regional allies to give it the geography from which to fight from, leveling the playing field against any Pacific threat. It's known as the tyranny of distance in the U.S. defense circles, and America has invested heavily in neutralizing this significant deficiency. Now the stage was set for China to completely upset U.S. Pacific strategy and perhaps open the door to victory in Taiwan and beyond. But China overstepped and misstepped, both. First, it failed to significantly influence Filipino elections after Duterte's final term, and the nation voted in favor of Ferdinand Bongbong Romualdez Marcos Jr., or simply Bongbong Marcos. Marcos is the son of renowned Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the country with an iron fist from 1965 to 1986. He was known for being grossly corrupt and eliminating any political opposition. But don't worry, the apple definitely fell far from the tree on this one, or so the entire world hopes. Though in truth, it's not exactly out of America's character to openly support dictators when it's strategically convenient. When it isn't anymore, well then it's time to get democratized, baby. Marcos's victory was a disaster for China. The Philippines' new president was a staunch U.S. ally, and it sees China as an existential threat not just to the Philippines, but the greater South Pacific region. For his part, Marcos would probably be a lot less outraged at China if the nation hadn't been illegally building military bases in other people's territorial waters. The U.S. has been criticized for neocolonialism, yet China is just doing things the old-fashioned way and taking territory by force. Under international law, every nation has an exclusive claim to waters a set distance from its shores. This can lead to conflict in places like the South China Sea, with so many different nations so close together. Citing post-World War II maps and claims that its sailing vessels have historically moved through those waters, China's laid claim to literally the entire South China Sea. And a quick look on the map reveals that China is in no way anywhere near its claims. China claims basically all of Vietnamese waters, half of the Philippines, and large chunks of Malaysia, Brunei, and beyond. China's claims include waters as much as 1,000 miles away from its own shores. This would be like the United States claiming basically all of Russia's Arctic coastline from Alaska, or all of the Philippines' west coast and most of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea's north coast from Guam. The 9-dash line has its origin in 1946, when Mao Zedong had drawn a map that suddenly showed the entire South China Sea as belonging to China because, well, why not? Unsurprisingly, affected nations laughed China's claims away, given that these waters were critical for their own economies. They kept on laughing until the 90s, when China's growing naval might suddenly became significantly less funny. China regularly sent Coast Guard vessels with actual military vessels in the distance to harass the fishing fleets of other nations. It also began to build up artificial islands from which to project power, and today has established multiple bases commonly referred to as unsinkable aircraft carriers in the region. Now, nobody's laughing anymore, and China's bullying has extended to capsizing other nations' ships, and in the case of Vietnam, simply moving their oil drilling wells right into Vietnamese territorial waters. In 2020, China sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat with 8 men on board for fishing near the Paracel Islands, and in 2014 it carried out a similar attack captured on video. China has also used its much larger vessels to intimidate and harass oil exploration vessels from other countries. China has started to shut other nations off of the energy and fish wealth of the South China Sea. The region's also estimated to contain one of the largest untapped oil and gas reserves in the world. So maintaining control of the waters China is contesting is becoming more and more vital.
Filipino fishermen who made their living fishing off of reefs, now regularly patrolled by hostile Chinese vessels, began to feel the economic pain. To reinforce its own territorial claims, the Philippines began to station Marines on various reefs or even floating wrecks, with China regularly ramming supply vessels or using water cannons to keep them away from resupplying their troops. The attacks slowed significantly during the Duterte years, but have now resumed with the election of Bongbong Marcos. And Marcos has had enough. Marcos made multiple military bases available for U.S. forces shortly after coming to power. This was a major win for the U.S., as it expanded its ability to station air power in the region, a chief concern for combating China in the Pacific. This only intensified China's efforts to bully Filipino vessels in the South China Sea, with the most recent incident including China erecting a floating barrier to keep Filipino fishermen out of a disputed reef. The barrier was dismantled by Filipino divers, and in response, Marcos announced even closer cooperation with the United States. The Philippines is a strategic linchpin for the U.S. in the Pacific. America's biggest weakness is the distance its forces have to travel to engage in battle. Even in a war that would take place primarily in the air and at sea, the tyranny of distance limits how long and how much the U.S. can fight. It even limits payloads on combat aircraft. However, the Philippines are less than 200 miles away from Taiwan at their nearest points, which would allow the U.S. air power to stage at Filipino airfields and run combat sorties against the Chinese ships and ground forces around or on the island. From the Philippines, U.S. air power could even regularly strike at the Chinese mainland, a critical need if the U.S. is to ensure victory over China in case of a war. Through its own bad behavior, China's ensured that the U.S. and the Philippines are closer than ever, and this has significantly weakened its own military position by doing so. As the old saying goes, China, you done played yourself.
It's the Zoomies versus the Squids, the United States Air Force versus the U.S. Navy, two of the most powerful, if not the most powerful forces on Earth, in a head-to-head matchup to determine just which branch is the best at their primary purpose, killing bad guys and breaking their stuff. For the sake of this thought exercise, we're going to ignore the normal realities of warfare and focus solely on firepower and assets. After all, in a realistic war scenario, the U.S. Navy could do something the U.S. Air Force could never do: blockade ports and stop the shipments of supplies. So we're going to be pitting man and machine in a straight-up deathmatch and find out which of the two services come out on top. Despite their close partnership with the U.S. Navy, for this fight the Marines are out. Sorry sailors, but you're fighting this one on your own. Likewise, U.S. Army forces, which typically help provide ground security for the Air Force assets, are also out, leaving the Zoomies to fend for themselves. Most of this war will naturally happen in the air, though without the support of their sister services, the U.S. Air Force does have one advantage that the Navy doesn't: the ability to deploy a moderate ground force against Navy targets. The Navy, after all, isn't just about ships. There's a long link of repair and resupply centers that are vital for keeping America's fleets out at sea. U.S. Air Force Security Forces personnel are, traditionally speaking, military police, no different than their counterparts in the other branches. However, during the Vietnam War, the Air Force realized that it couldn't always rely on the other services for protection of its airfields in hostile territory, and quickly established a training program to convert their military police personnel into small but competent infantry forces. Today, Security Forces personnel are all trained in air-based defense and receive qualification training with heavy squad weapons such as the .50 caliber machine gun and the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher. Some of these personnel are even qualified for air assault operations. Numbers are hard to pin down, but there's an estimated 25,000 U.S. Air Force Security Forces personnel currently on active duty, giving the Air Force a sizable ground assault element that the Navy can't match. While U.S. Navy Masters-at-Arms are trained in protecting ships and shore installations, their focus and training isn't as exhaustive in ground combat roles as Air Force Security Forces personnel, with the focus shifting from protecting airfields from unsophisticated terror and insurgent threats to a potential showdown against regular Chinese or Russian infantry units. U.S. Air Force Security Forces personnel have recently begun a program to seriously upgrade their standards, training, and equipment to meet these near-peer competitor threats. The stated goal of the U.S. Air Force is to produce a force comparable to U.S. Army light infantry, powerful enough to repel a coordinated attack from near-peer competitors. This means new tools such as anti-tank and anti-air man-portable weapon systems and fire support platforms such as mortars, as well as a stronger emphasis on assault and defense operations. On the ground, it's clear that the Air Force has a serious advantage, being able to deploy a sizable force to seize vital U.S. Navy ground installations and repel any assaults against its facilities. But the primary combatants in this showdown are going to be aircraft and ships. So how do they measure up, and what can they add to this fight? The first step in this battle between the services will be establishing air superiority, as the primary armament of both services is going to be its aircraft. In the Navy's corner, we have the F/A-18 Super Hornet, an aircraft developed to counter advances in Soviet fighter design. Turns out the Navy completely overcompensated and created one of the most formidable fighter aircraft ever built. Responding to the Navy's Super Hornet threat is going to be the F-15 Strike Eagle, another development created in response to the advancements made in Soviet fighter design. Both aircraft come from the same manufacturer, meaning they share many of the same strengths, making this a difficult matchup to determine. The F-15 is an air superiority fighter, but it's primarily geared for ground attack role. The Hornet is instead a jack-of-all-trades, doing everything from air superiority to suppression of enemy air defenses, recon, and even aerial refueling. That versatility gives the Navy greater flexibility and makes sense for a service which has limited space on its aircraft carriers. The better buy for your money is the aircraft that can do multiple things well, rather than a single specialized task. But in this fight, which is better? The F-15 is powered by dual Pratt & Whitney F100 turbofan engines, producing 29,000 pounds of thrust at full afterburner, versus the Hornet's General Electric F414 engines putting out 22,000 pounds of thrust at full afterburner. This gives the F-15 a speed advantage of a whopping 700 miles per hour, with the F-15 clocking in at 1,875 miles per hour versus the F-18 at 1,190 miles per hour. The F-15s are going to get to the fight first every time, and if they get in trouble, they'll easily outrun any pursuing F-18s, leaving them in the dust. By comparison, F-18s trying to flee from the Air Force's Strike Eagles are going to wind up getting splashed. The Eagle also has greater fuel and weapons capacity than the Hornet, with the F-15 carrying up to 23,000 pounds of fuel and weapons versus the F-18's 17,759 pounds. More fuel and more missiles means the Air Force's fighter can stay in the fight longer and shoot more, and gives the F-15 nearly double the range of the Navy's F-18. However, the Navy's F-18 can carry the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, giving it a robust capability in destroying enemy ground and even airborne radar, while the F-15 cannot. Conversely, the F-15 can carry the GBU-28 bunker buster bomb, while the F-18 can't. The F-18 is slightly more agile than the F-15, however, which would give it the advantage in close-quarters dogfighting. Although, as many enemy combatants around the world have found out, the F-15 is an absolutely terrifying dogfighter itself. Targeting and tracking systems on both aircraft are nearly identical, given that both aircraft operate for the same country. When it comes to long-range detection, the APG-82 radar has greater capabilities than the APG-79 radar used by the Hornet. Although just how much greater capabilities is a mystery, as the data is a closely guarded secret. What's clear is that the Air Force Strike Eagles will get to the fight first, see their targets first, and fire first, putting the Navy's Super Hornet at a disadvantage. However, the F-18 is equipped with infrared search and tracking capabilities, giving it a chance to take on stealth aircraft at close range. With 769 Hornets versus the Air Force's 454 Eagles, the number advantage may seem to be in favor of the Navy, except the 769 Hornets the Navy possesses represents the entirety of its air attack and air superiority forces. By comparison, the U.S. Air Force can call on an additional 1,017 F-16 Fighting Falcons and 229 operational F-35 Lightnings. The Navy's own F-35s only number at 21 and are currently still only used for training. However, the absolute silver bullet in the sky for the Air Force is its fleet of F-22 Raptors, numbering at 186. While low in number, the Raptor is without comparison the world's most advanced air superiority fighter, featuring a radar cross-section the size of a marble. Its armament may be limited as it's forced to carry its weapons internally, but its powerful radar allows it to detect enemy aircraft and engage them at beyond visual range. While the Air Force initially wanted a fleet of almost 1,000 of these incredible aircraft, the extreme price tag upwards of $220 million per aircraft, as well as a lack of a realistic threat to face off against by any other nation, shelved the original production run and limited it to the number the Air Force currently operates. Simply put, in an air battle, the US Navy is going to come out losing badly. Not only is it completely dwarfed by the numbers of the Air Force air superiority fighters, the Air Force's F-22 presents a threat that an F-18 pilot is unlikely to survive. Luckily, the number of these airborne assassins is relatively low. However, the Navy can call upon support from its large fleet of warships, who, thanks to modern battle networks, can add their firepower to an air battle. While its fleet of dozens of attack submarines may seem like an odd fish out in this fight, many of them are capable of taking on land attack roles thanks to the addition of cruise missiles to their magazines. With a range of 1,550 miles, Navy subs could deliver crippling blows to U.S. Air Force installations with little if any warning. Likewise, its fleet of 91 destroyers and 19 corvettes could all strike at Air Force airfields. A vast inventory of anti-air missiles, such as the RIM-174 and the RIM-162 Evolved Sea Sparrow, can project serious anti-aircraft firepower into a fight, leaving U.S. Air Force planes at risk in any air battle within range of U.S. Navy ships. The U.S. Air Force is not the primary service for neutralizing an enemy fleet. That task falls on the U.S. Navy, but it is still very well equipped to deal with hostile vessels. The AGM-158 JASSM and the AGM-86 are both extremely long-range standoff attack air-launched cruise missiles, packing a 1,000-pound warhead capable of sinking enemy ships. The AGM-158C is the latest iteration of these anti-ship missiles and features greatly improved technology, allowing it to locate, track, and target hostile vessels independently while ignoring civilian shipping. These missiles are all low observable, making them difficult to spot on radar, and are programmed to fly extremely close to the ocean's surface, which makes them even more difficult to spot and target by a ship's anti-missile defense systems. However, none of these weapons are supersonic, as the US is currently coming far behind Russia and China in developing supersonic weapons. This means the individual success rate of each missile is dramatically lowered when pitted up against the Navy's sophisticated anti-missile defense systems. Though the AGM-158C is capable of coordinating with other missiles to conduct swarm attacks, approaching a target from multiple directions in overwhelming numbers. Increasingly, this fight is turning bad for the U.S. Navy. With an air superiority fleet that's less than half the size of the U.S. Air Force, and with aircraft outmatched technologically by the Air Force, the Navy will never be able to establish air superiority. Even more importantly, though, the Navy's Hornets will never be able to establish air superiority at the standoff attack distances required to stop Air Force bomber aircraft from launching anti-ship attacks. While Navy fleet defenses are likely capable of chewing up most of the Air Force's surface attack aircraft, the Air Force's ability to attack with long-range precision weapons means their vulnerable bomber aircraft can target and fire from well outside of the air defense envelope of the Navy. One way the Navy plans on protecting its surface fleets from this threat against a near-peer competitor, such as China or Russia, is to simply establish combat air patrols at greatly extended ranges, using F-18s in tanker mode, or new tanker drones to refuel F-18s assigned to long-range air patrols. However, no other nation can bring to bear against the U.S. Navy the sheer number and capabilities of the U.S. Air Force, and in a real-world situation, the Navy would always rely on Air Force help to protect its ships. Air power will determine this battle, and the Navy loses in that arena. While Navy ships would be able to launch attacks against Air Force airfields and ground installations, they won't last long against coordinated Air Force attacks by fleets of B-1 Lancers and B-52s equipped with standoff long-range munitions and protected by fleets of F-16s, F-15s, F-35s, and F-22s. Air Force planes would always be able to redeploy to civilian or even improvised airfields, but Navy fighters will find that their only safe landing site, their aircraft carriers, will very quickly end up at the bottom of the sea. With complete and total air superiority, the U.S. Air Force is without a doubt the victor of this conflict. Though in reality, this conclusion is no surprise. Air power has long been the single most important weapon in modern war since World War II, leaving any foe without suitable air power at the absolute mercy of even an inferior army that is supported by a competent Air Force. However, it's also a matter of different mission sets that sees the Air Force declared a winner. The U.S. Navy is indeed tasked with air superiority, but its vessels are also designed for a wide range of different responsibilities, from surface warfare to subsurface warfare, and the escort and deployment of ground combat troops to beaches around the world. The Air Force, however, has a far more limited scope of missions: air superiority, recon, and ground attack, and its equipment is thus far more capable in these arenas than the Navy's. In truth, neither service could win a war without the other, and the two are equal and vital partners in ensuring the U.S. military remains the most powerful on Earth. But squids would totally get their butt kicked by zoomies any day of the week. Ever since you were a kid, you dreamed of going to space. You would watch shuttle launches, imagining what it would be like to be one of those massive ships being shot up above the atmosphere. The only thing more exciting than those? Sci-fi movies about space exploration, high-tech battles between spaceships, and taking the fight against evil to the new frontier. But there was always one big question: how can I make this my life? You wanted to be part of the team exploring the great beyond, but you didn't know how to get there. Then one day, you were watching the news when you saw something that made you sit up and pay attention. It only took 2 words: Space Force. The United States has been keeping an eye on the sky for a long time, planning for the day when our enemies gained the ability to break Earth's atmosphere and place weapons in orbit. In 1982, the Air Force opened up a new division called the Air Force Space Command, with the mission to provide resilient and affordable space capabilities for the Joint Force and the nation. They launched satellites to monitor space, deter the militarization of space through surveillance and intelligence analysis, and increase the government's presence in space for non-combat functions like weather and navigation. Based out of Vandenberg Air Force Base and Cape Canaveral, they controlled all Department of Defense satellites and were key in monitoring potential missile attacks. But they were mostly a defensive force. That all changed in 2018, when President Donald Trump talked about his ideas for a new branch of the military called Space Force. It would be an independent government-run division dedicated to preparing the United States for space warfare. While no war has ever taken place in space, the Space Force would study the art of satellite versus satellite combat and space-to-ground warfare, where satellites would attack targets on Earth. A lot of people were skeptical at first. After all, no other country has come close to launching space warfare programs capable of threatening the United States, and asked if we really needed to add a new division of the military. But when the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020 was passed, it included funding for the Space Force and was renamed the Air Force Space Command as its own independent division of the military, the first new one since the Air Force became independent in 1947. As soon as you hear about the Space Force, you know you want to be a part of it. The idea of defending the United States against high-tech threats and beyond excites you, but you've got a lot of questions. What is the Space Force looking for? What skills do people need to join? Will there be a Space Force Academy? As you look for answers, it becomes clear that the new division of the military has as many questions as you do. Space Force is in its earliest days, and any new recruits are going to be part of one of the biggest experiments in United States military history. Recruitment is just ramping up, but the one thing you find out quickly is that there isn't going to be a traditional Space Force Academy. So much for your idea of rushing out of your house to the recruitment center and starting your big adventure. Rather, the Space Force is looking for the best of the best from different divisions of the military to recruit into an elite team of initial recruits. It's going to take a few years, but the Pentagon hopes to transition people into this new branch of the service through a personnel and training center. The Army, Navy, and Air Force are the branches being targeted for potential recruitment, and the military sees a potential full enlistment of 15,000 soldiers. This is much smaller than any other division, with 1.3 million in the Army, 400,000 in the Navy, 321,000 in the Air Force, 168,000 in the Marines, and 42,000 in the Coast Guard. Eventually, the Space Force will have the same presence in the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the other branches, with a 4-star general representing them in meetings with the President. They'll also have an Undersecretary for Space who will report to the Secretary of the Air Force. When the Space Force was founded, it got its first official member, General John J. Raymond, who was appointed the country's first Chief of Space Operations. He's now hard at work on setting up the division's infrastructure, starting their operations, and recruiting talented soldiers, pilots, and sailors to his ranks. So it seems to get to the Space Force, you're going to have to go the long way. Most enlisted members of the division will be members of either the Army, Navy, or Air Force, so anyone excited to join should head down to their local recruitment office. But the Space Force isn't looking for any tough-as-nails soldier. The work of preparing for space warfare is highly technical and reliant on scientific knowledge, so they're going to be looking for specialized personnel. Many Air Force Space Command members will be transferring over immediately, giving the division a strong start, but they'll need more. A look at the Space Force website shows that they're looking for a wide variety of backgrounds. Specialties the Space Force is looking for include computers and computer science, electronics, emergency management and response, engineering, future technologies, logistics and transportation, and missile and space technology. They're also looking for intelligence experts, natural science specialists, those with experience in special warfare and weaponry, and maintenance and repair. And because those who join the Space Force will be signing on for potential missions under unusual conditions humans aren't used to, they're looking for a large number of healthcare workers, including specialists in surgery, mental health, health technology, and dentistry. Your head is spinning. If you want to join this initial class, which field should you specialize in? The good news is the Space Force has a way of helping you make that decision. Just up the page from the list of specialties is a personal career assessment test that takes you to the Air Force's Work Interest Navigator. By signing up and answering a battery of questions about your work history, interests, and skills, you can get through an assessment of your potential place in the division and what role you could play in the Space Force. You might get more than one potential placement, which is good if your first placement doesn't come through. So is joining the Air Force your best bet for getting into Space Force? That depends. The Air Force is smaller than the Navy or Army, and it tends to recruit more toward people with pre-existing skills that will make it easy to hit the ground running in the highly technical world of U.S. air combat. That makes it the most challenging branch of the armed forces to currently join, and your first step should be to visit a military recruiter. They'll discuss career choices with you, and it's on to the MEP station, the Military Entrance Processing Station, where you'll be examined by a military doctor and screened for disqualifying factors. You'll be asked about your education, your criminal history, your age, and your personal and medical history. And then it's time to take a mini ASVAB to see how you're likely to do on the actual test. A test? You weren't told there'd be a test. But there is the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Battery, which analyzes your skills for the armed forces and determines where you'll be best suited among the different divisions and subdivisions. You'll answer 145 multiple-choice questions, but don't worry, there isn't much at stake besides your future position in the armed forces. The good news is you might have already taken the ASVAB. It's commonly given to high school seniors as part of a partnership with the military to pre-screen students for potential recruitment into the military. But many people get turned away from the Air Force every year for reasons that vary, from not scoring high enough in desired areas on the ASVAB to any number of red flags in their personal or medical history. If this happens, is it the end of the road for Space Force? No, the Space Force is going to be recruiting from across the military, including the Army and Navy. Those have a lower bar for recruitment in a larger standing force, but if it's your goal to be recruited from there, your best odds are if you have a specialty skill that's going to be needed in the new division. A naval recruit with a strong background in repairing advanced machinery, like the technology on U.S. aircraft carriers, will have a leg up. So will anyone who has medical background in the Navy, as the two divisions have similar concerns about medical emergencies in unusual and close-quarter situations, whether it's inside a submarine or a space shuttle. Like all high-level divisions of the U.S. military, the Space Force is highly classified, and that means that anyone who wants to be a part of them will have to undergo a security screening. This isn't just to determine if you're a risk to the military secrets you'll be exposed to, but if you have any connections that could compromise you, intentionally or not. Expect a long, probing interview about your past, your family history, and your finances. This will determine whether you receive a security clearance or not, which is essential for any high-level job in the Air Force or Space Force. But what if you don't want to work your way up the ranks of the military division in hopes of one day being pulled into the Space Force? You have a passion for the world of space warfare, and you love to get in on the ground floor, even if it's starting at the bottom and helping out in the most humble ways. Are there any civilian positions available in this new military division? Good news and bad news. There are civilian positions available, but the Space Force is looking for those who have a general security clearance of 12 or above and aren't looking among the general public. They're recruiting among former military veterans, former federal agents, or family members of federal officials who have already been vetted by the U.S. government. No matter what route you take into the Space Force, this division will be one of the most secure ever managed by the U.S. military. After all, it's developing a whole new branch of warfare from the ground up, preparing for future threats and hoping to fend them off before they arise. So it seems like whatever route you take into the Space Force, it's going to be a long one. The government isn't going to just let anyone into their newest and highly secure military division. Right now, space exploration has drifted more into the hands of private entrepreneurs, as billionaires like Elon Musk conduct independent rocket launches to private space satellites. But as countries including China ramp up their own space presence, the Space Force is being organized to create an orderly transition for the U.S. military presence into space. But is the U.S. actually getting ready to fight a war in space? The answer is no, and yes. Right now, space is still considered to be neutral and international territory. While only the United States has put people on the moon, 12 countries have landed probes there, and both the United States and the Soviet Union have successfully landed spacecrafts on Mars. No countries have claimed territories in space besides privately owned artificial satellites, but as the world's superpowers ramp up their space exploration, the United States wants to make it clear that any attempt to militarize it won't go unanswered. The Space Force aims to create a strong military presence to protect our interests and deter aggression in, from, and to space, while giving us the freedom to conduct our own space operations undisturbed. The Space Force is just getting started and has a long way to go before it fulfills its mission. So does anyone who wants to join up, so there's only one solution. If you want to be in the Space Force, join a related division, work hard, and prove yourself so the brass comes calling.
In 2016, the internet was abuzz with interviews from U.S. military personnel detailing their encounter with a 13-foot giant in the wilderness of Afghanistan. According to one military contractor, in 2002, the U.S. Special Forces encountered and killed a giant after suffering one casualty to the cryptid spear. The story went around the world and back again, with theories bolstered by a mixture of fiction and facts. The official government response consisted of one statement claiming that they have no records of such an event or any giant men being slain by their forces in Afghanistan or anywhere else. But what really happened in 2002 to the U.S. military? In the year immediately following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in what it called Operation Enduring Freedom. It wouldn't take long for the event to become known as the War in Afghanistan, which lasted until 2021 and was one of the primary campaigns in America's War on Terror. This explains the widespread presence of the U.S. military on Afghan soil. According to one interview in 2002, a few U.S. soldiers disappeared during a patrol in Kandahar, a remote region of southern Afghanistan. The story told in the interview and then repeated by other sources goes as follows. The U.S. Army HQ sent a group of Special Forces, U.S. Navy SEALs in particular, to investigate the sudden end of radio contact. While the small unit investigated the disappearance, they found a cave in the mountain strewn with military equipment but no soldiers or their remains in sight. The scene suggested the unit was ambushed by someone or thing and either fell down the steep drop or were trapped in the cave. However, the lack of initial request for aerial backup, which was the standard for the U.S. military, was odd and inexplicable. And then something came out of the cave, and it wasn't entirely human. According to the report from one of the soldiers, the creature was a humanoid red-head giant, between 12 and 15 feet tall, with 6 fingers on each hand and presumably 6 toes on each foot. Before they could take aim, one of the soldiers rushed the creature, which would be a deadly mistake. The giant impaled the foolhardy soldier with a spear. The remaining soldiers opened fire and killed the giant after what was reported to be close to 30 seconds of continuous firing. Now bear in mind that it usually doesn't take more than a second or two for a person to get shredded by bullets from an entire squad. The soldiers immediately called for a medevac, which was a Chinook helicopter, and the giant was scooped up and transported away. Then all involved parties signed an NDA to never reveal any details about what happened in the Kandahar Mountains. But that changed in 2016 when some of the soldiers broke their NDA because the world deserved to know the truth. And that's pretty much the extent of the video from 2016. The short film made by author and filmmaker L.A. Marzulli, a self-proclaimed expert on cryptids and the supernatural, used 2 interviews with soldiers who were involved or knew of the event that transpired in 2002. Immediately, theories started to materialize about the Giant of Kandahar. According to Marzulli, the giant's appearance nicely aligns with the biblical interpretation of the Nephilim, commonly seen as giants. According to Marzulli's show, the eyewitness account in the interview identified the giant's weapon as a large pike or spear. Marzulli produced a chunk of bronze that he claimed aligned with the biblical interpretation of a spear that would weigh 300 shekels, or 7.5 pounds. The eyewitness seemed to agree that this could align with the weapon the supposed giant used to kill the U.S. soldier. Marzulli tied this account to other archaeological evidence that could be interpreted to indicate the presence of a race of giants between 12 and 18 feet tall, which was the main subject of his series, The Watchers, where the interview was presented. Shortly after the video aired in August 2016, forum boards and websites focusing on biblical and cryptid sightings buzzed with activity. Many interested parties proposed theories about the giant's identity and whether more could be found in Afghanistan. This led to a widespread notion that the U.S. government was hiding critical information to help uncover the event's truth. In the same month, Snopes, one of the major websites focusing on debunking or confirming internet myths, contacted the Department of Defense to investigate. The spokesperson for the department claimed that they have no record or information about a Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar. Naturally, the cryptid boards weren't convinced. The government statement was interpreted as an attempt to cover up the truth. At the same time, Marzulli told right-wing news outlets that the government was hiding something that the world had to know right now. In doing so, he only further ingratiated himself with his viewers and followers, who were now fully convinced that the Giant of Kandahar was an entirely historical event cleanly hidden from view. Only now, cracks were forming to reveal the truth beneath. Snopes went further into their investigation based on the little palpable clues in the story. One of the most significant details was that the giant killed a Special Forces member who was referred to as Dan. So Snopes checked the U.S. Army records for deaths in 2002, narrowing down the search to soldiers named Dan or Daniel, which yielded only one result: Sergeant First Class Daniel A. Romero. According to the official report, Romero was killed in April 2002 during a mission to dispose of bombs and other explosive ordnance near Kandahar. The U.S. Army ruled that the death was purely accidental and didn't involve any foul play or supernatural intervention. News outlets covered the story, and the number of casualties in the event was 4, including Daniel, which doesn't match the story presented in the interview. Furthermore, Snopes couldn't find any reports of an entire patrol squad missing in the U.S. Army records, which would have likely been publicly posted and verified. Besides, the story's entire premise reads much like fiction, especially when you consider that the story doesn't even resolve based on the premise it set out. The main interviewer never suggested what happened to the troop, or if the U.S. Army HQ initiated further investigations to locate the missing patrol. As such, it's safe to say that there was no missing patrol in the first place, meaning it's highly likely the story was fictional from the beginning. To boot, all the other viable sources on the matter relating to the Giant of Kandahar were practically circular or non-existent. They all go back to the now-deleted YouTube video containing the interview. A reproduction of the video contained no new information, and the trail of clues, as thin as it already was, ended there. Ultimately, the Giant of Kandahar story was probably entirely fabricated by Marzulli to spark interest in his work and gain more popularity or prestige among conspiracy theorists. So what really happened to the US military if they didn't encounter a giant? In 2002, the Afghan war was in full effect, with skirmishes happening regularly. It was most likely the story, if it existed among the military in the first place, was a way for senior members to stave off tension or even haze newer members. According to Marzulli, the second interviewee claimed that by 2005, the US HQ required soldiers to carry weapons which they could aim above an average human's height. This could offer a potential explanation. Since Kandahar is a mountainous region, ambushes would likely happen from higher terrain. The year 2002 saw the death of 17 soldiers due to hostile action across all branches of the U.S. Army, according to the Defense Casualty Analysis System. It's highly probable that some of the deaths in Afghanistan were construed as coming from a supernatural source by the soldiers themselves, perhaps in an effort to minimize the threat that the U.S. enemy posed at the time. Simultaneously, the story would likely profoundly affect troop psychology, keeping them more alert on missions. Alternatively, there's a straightforward answer that the giant was, in fact, just a person of above-average height. However, even if that was the case, the theory quickly fell apart because it didn't conform to the rest of the details presented by so-called eyewitnesses and retellers. Then there's also the fact that the subject of Nephilim itself has various depictions that Marzulli failed to take into account. Also called Rephaim, the Nephilim were mentioned in the book of Genesis as the result of reproduction between sons of God and daughters of Adam, or rather divine beings and human women. Various translations of the Bible use the term Nephilim, originally Hebrew Nephilim, to mean giant or fallen, giving the beings the epithet fallen ones. In most of the books that make up the Bible, the role of these giants is to die at the hands of humans who were God's chosen. This was perhaps evocative of the fight between the underdog and the oppressive force that stood against the nation of Israel. It wouldn't take long before the myth of the Nephilim would be equated and merged with other popular myths across cultures, regions, and even eras. In the Greek translation of biblical texts, the Hebrew word Nephilim has been translated and equated with Greek gigantes, which referred to as the giants of their own separate myths. In Greek mythology, giants were considered to be born in Gaia, the earth, when the titan Kronos castrated the tyrannical sky god Uranus. However, most interpretations of the Greek giants don't refer to them being larger than the average human, but refer to giants as being of excessive aggression and strength. In fact, the Greek Titans, which were traditionally considered an earlier generation of superhuman beings, would more aptly be regarded as the analog to the Nephilim. Even the Greek translation doesn't always translate Nephilim as gigantes. The word passes into the transcript in a few passages with its stricter translation of fallen. This would equate the translation with the Bible's original interpretation of the Nephilim being somewhere between divinity and the mortals, arousing fascination with the book's contemporary readers. In the end, the similarities between the biblical race of the Nephilim and the Greek giants would be more grounded in a cultural and spiritual sense than dimensions. Both imply that the beings have descended from the religious version of a heavenly domain and were subsequently trapped in the underworld analogs. However, by that time, the damage was done. The Greek translation was used as the basis for medieval translations of the Bible that spread across Europe, and in doing so, the word gigantes got translated into physically large and influenced Nephilim's more modern artistic interpretations. Perhaps the most common story involving giants could be found in the legendary myth of David and Goliath, where the latter is described as a Philistine giant. While the Philistines were analyzed and identified as a group of ancient people who lived in the southern parts of modern-day Israel, Goliath's appearance as a giant can be disputed to mean a person of above-average proportions. The reason is the most common descriptions found in transliterated texts don't align with the common descriptions of Nephilim. This could be a more plausible explanation of what transpired in 2002, just a group of soldiers who killed a raving tall man in a cave. However, that wouldn't have made an interesting story and would likely not have been published by news outlets. Tellingly, this kind of story taps into humanity's fascination with the unknown, perhaps in an attempt to minimize the emotional and psychological toll of traumatic events or uncertainty. For example, one study showcased that classical myths still prevail in shaping the human experience long after the civilizations that created the myth no longer exist. According to anthropologists, these myths are imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the world. The myth's narrative structure depends on the situation and how the culture that created it coped with its environment. To use the giant of Kandahar as an example, the original myth likely is based on the mythical depiction of the story David and Goliath. It's possible, therefore, that the soldiers who created and populated said myth were putting themselves in the shoes of the Navy SEALs who defeated the giant. However, the giant itself stands for their entire environment. If we take a slight step back, the story begins with a sudden disappearance. The patrolling squad, a unit that's supposed to be defensive or protective, loses contact with the rest of the U.S. Army. It wouldn't take many leaps of the imagination to see the resemblance of the events that started the War on Terror. Specifically, we're talking about 9/11. The analogy is relatively simple. The disappearance of the squad represents the fall of the Twin Towers. Even though it might seem preposterous to equate the two, the similarities can be broken down. The Twin Towers represented the American standard. To an outsider, they might have only been hunks of stone, metal, and glass that equated to a large target. However, if you go beyond that, the towers represented American supremacy as an economic and perhaps more importantly military superpower of the modern world. That status was what many countries wanted to have or to take from America. By making the towers their target, Al-Qaeda ensured that the spotlight was on them, and they made their purpose as an enemy of American culture and values known to the world. In a way, the fall of the Twin Towers represents the same initial shock experienced by the soldiers in the story of the Giant of Kandahar. The destruction of the World Trade Center immediately shook the core of a country that was considered impervious to outside forces, and the event was entirely out of the scope of imagination or even reason. The same mindset applied to the initial disappearance of the patrol squad as something without seemingly cause or explanation. Then both stories unfold to create a narrative of uncertainty. In the case of the myth, special forces were dispatched to potentially dangerous terrain to investigate the unknown. In reality, the War on Terror brought the U.S. Army to Afghanistan, where soldiers were dropped onto hostile ground with no way of knowing how events would unfold. There can be some debate as to what the giant represents in real life. However, it's pretty clear that it's the analog of terrorists in one way or another. The soldier who died during his fight with a giant is likely representative of the American soldiers who lost their lives in Afghanistan. Just like Dan, who's killed at the hands of the giant, an enemy that came out of the cave and was beyond comprehension, the soldiers saw their potential deaths to terrorists in a similar way. You have to remember, the war in Afghanistan was a war of attrition with an enemy who was in its native element, using hostile terrain against the U.S. Army. To a soldier, this could have translated into opposing forces coming out of the darkness to ambush them. In fact, ambushes were pretty common over the entire length of the war due to their universal presence as guerrilla tactics that leveraged terrain to their advantage. The Center for Strategic and International Studies suggested that up until 2019, roughly 10% of U.S. Army casualties occurred outside of offensive combat operations. These include ambushes, snipers, and roadside bombs. In a sense, they represent the hidden danger that surrounds the soldiers at every step. Therefore, the fight of the soldiers against the Kandahar Giant is evocative of the entire U.S. Army's efforts to defeat terrorism as the regime in itself. It's also likely the story came about as a coping mechanism to deal with the uncertainties and the losses accrued during the war. In a sense, Dan represents the friends that American soldiers have lost in 9/11 and the entire war that's followed. By combining the shadowy regime of terrorism within the confines of a giant, albeit supernatural entity, but still a singular figure, the soldiers have created a palpable enemy. As the story progresses, the soldiers defeat the enemy and save the day. Just like the story doesn't have a happy ending in the sense that the original casualties in the disappearing patrol were not mentioned or retrieved, so does the American War on Terror not have a clear end in sight. The triggering event shook the whole world and possibly entirely removed the notion that one country could become a veritable superpower that cannot be contested. Additionally, just like 9/11 left a deep mark on the world's collective memory, it's safe to say that the events featured in the story of the Giant of Kandahar entered the collective memory of the soldiers. This is best evidenced in the notion that the story was an open secret, with the second interview mentioning that it was known among the soldiers years after it was officially initiated. In fact, the story of the Giant of Kandahar is not the only such myth to arise within the confines of modern warfare. According to author Nick Orton, the U.S. soldiers would frequently encounter supernatural events, whether in the form of UFOs, ghosts, or cryptids like the Giant. He's written down some of those accounts in his collection, Tales from the Grid Square. In one instance, a soldier observed a massive heat signature in the distance through his thermal scope. While this could have been explained by a group of fighters huddled together around a fire, the soldier claimed that the signature got up and moved in unison. According to him, the creature, later dubbed the Giant of Kunar, was around 12 to 15 feet tall. In another story, an Air Force operator noticed 3 giants tending to a herd of sheep up in the mountains. According to his account, he could discern the giant's height by the ruler tool on his crosshair, which suggested the beings to be roughly 12 feet tall. Again, the similarities between the accounts are relatively clear, especially regarding the apparent size and stature of the giants. While all the stories have a similar air of fiction, it's highly possible that they were influenced by the same originator, which is likely the story of the Kandahar Giant. As we mentioned previously, even if it is mythologically significant and analogous to the American War on Terror, the Kandahar Giant is a relatively simple rendition of the classical myth of David and Goliath. Just like the original story resonates with the audience by its narrative of suffering, surprise, and overcoming adverse odds, so does the myth of the Kandahar Giant represent the soldiers' firm belief that they would be able to end the war in their favor. Unlike the story, where the conclusion is relatively vague, the war in Afghanistan unofficially ended in 2021. However, real-life endings don't often have the same impact as myths. The Taliban rapidly assaulted the native forces present in the country, causing NATO troops to withdraw from Afghanistan entirely. This left the Afghan government, which was heavily dependent on foreign aid for function and defense alike, with minimal protection against future incursions. In effect, the Taliban regained control over most of the country's territory and overthrew the republic in favor of restoring the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The emirate is now ranked 180th out of the 191 territories in the Human Development Index, showing that the territory is among the most troubled in the world. With that kind of unsavory ending to this story, the potential of myths to inspire and provide emotional and psychological relief undoubtedly creates a new spectrum of human experiences to strive toward. The shared narrative of the Kandahar Giant is more of a positive outlook on the realities of the war for U.S. soldiers, especially considering that the myth began in the second year of what would end up being a 20-year campaign, rife with strategic mistakes that ended with the U.S. unceremoniously leaving the country with its tail between its legs after spending close to $2.3 trillion funding the war effort, and the interim government that ultimately failed to take hold. However, it's essential to understand that the myth of the Giant of Kandahar remains just a story told by soldiers to make their days pass by faster. While comparisons to the events surrounding them can provide some insight into the emotional turmoil of war, it's essential to acknowledge the sacrifices those soldiers involved made. Most importantly, it always pays to stick more to the facts as the basis for decision-making and belief systems. Now check out Mongolian death worm. This is why you never want to come across it. Or watch this instead.